Welcome to Eternal Christendom, consecrated to Our Lady for the glory of our Lord. I'm Joshua Charles. So today I'm very excited to present an interview that I just finished with my sister, Nancy Charles, about her, frankly, miraculous conversion. She came from a long period of being in the LGBTQ movement, almost, medically transitioning because she thought she was a man, or transitioning, the transgender movement, drugs, suicide attempts, just incredible stuff. And God rescued her and brought her home to his church. It's an amazing story. So this will be the first interview where I'm actually going to have my sister here because I just thought that would be more fitting, and I'm going to interview her from my office. So in a little bit, you'll see Nancy standing where I am, and you'll see me in my office interviewing her. So I can't wait to share this with you. We're also sharing it on March 19th because March 19th is a feast day of St. Joseph, and it's the day on which God miraculously touched my sister's heart at Mass. She'll tell the whole story in the interview coming up. And also today, March 19th, 2025, she is speaking at Mar-a-Lago, the private residence of President Donald Trump. She was asked to speak at a Catholic event. We're also proud of her, and we wanted to present this interview on the same day as that talk. So without further ado, my sister, Nancy Charles.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
Amen.
O most gracious Virgin Mary, never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thine intercession was left unaided. Inspired by this confidence, we fly unto thee, O Virgin of Virgins, our Mother. To thee do we come, before thee we stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not our petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer us.
Amen.
Amen. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. We ask the guardian angels, both Josh, mine, and all those of the audience members watching today, that they kindly guide us and our ability to hear what we need to hear, say what we need to say, and converse about what we need to converse about. Saint Ignatius of Antioch, pray for us. Saint Michael the Archangel, pray for us. And Saint Joseph, pray for us. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. So nobody's better at telling your story than you. But before we get into it, why don't we provide a super brief summary? And I'll do it because I know you're not always super brief. So the super brief summary is that you're Catholic now, grew up evangelical Protestant, went through a long period of struggle with LGBTQ type stuff, drugs, suicide, etc. And that's the broad summary. So that's what we're going to get into. So now that people have a sense of where we're going, you start wherever you want, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I mean, you said it the best. I think that the first part of my life was, obviously we grew up in the same home. We were brought up in church. Although it's funny because whenever you talk about church, church always seemed to mean a little bit more to you than it did to me. I think by that point in our childhood, I was already struggling with other things that was deeply separating me from Christ. And so I really wasn't that involved in church in the same capacity, I guess, mentally. So I had already sort of checked out. And then obviously as we got older, we are, unfortunately now the children of a divorced family. Mm-hmm. That I think was the beginning of my inevitable super breakdown, which led to because it was right on the cusp of me getting my freedom. Yeah, I remember I was just getting into college, and it was just such a turbulent time for our family that that's when I started entering and getting into the drugs, and I absolutely came out to our mother. I actually came out to you first as being gay. I don't know if you remember that. Do you remember?
Oh, yeah. I thought it was very ironic because I was kind of known as the more or the most probably religious member of the family. Doesn't mean I was perfect. I was far from it, but I just thought it was very interesting that I don't know if you and I have talked about that since it happened as far as like why you chose me to do that too. Because surely you must have known that I would have been the most, I still loved you and I expressed that, but I'm not approving of behavior along those lines,
Right. Yeah, I thought about it only briefly, but I mean, one, I think there's a part of you that's always been easy to talk to, which is nice. And I feel like many share that, which is why many come to you and have these really hard conversations. But also, I think maybe there was something just too intense about going straight to the parents. I definitely, our father was not somebody I was going to go to immediately. Yeah. But I was really scared. The core of that fear was that when I share this, that it'll be the end of my family.
Yeah.
Like that I would be disowned completely. And so I think maybe in some ways it felt safer to come to you because of that. There's a little more fear in being disowned by your parents than by your brother.
Sure.
Maybe there's an aspect of that, but
Well, and to be clear, just so people know, we've had, divorce is horrible, and we'll get into more detail, but there is somewhat of a good ending. Our dad has come into the church, our mom has come into the church, our stepdad has come into the church, you've come into the church. So, there are pains and injuries in this that will never be fully healed in this life. But there has been a lot of healing as well. In fact, just recently we celebrated with our dad. We're posting this on March 19th, but just recently we celebrated our dad's birthday with a lot of members of the family, and it was great. And so there's been a lot of healing. So I just want people to know that before we dive into it. Yeah. So
absolutely. Yeah. No, our family's been, I mean, it's pretty miraculous what we've experienced in our family from where we came to where we are now. And so, absolutely. Anyway, as time went on, I think as I started to finally, when I came out of the closet, so to speak, that was the beginning of like basically walking off a cliff that I didn't realize, and so it was the beginning of like, I would say the next 10 to 15 years I spent, I was active in the LGBT community. And when I say the community, I just mean that I was, I would have self-identified as gay. Sure. But, and so, I, had girlfriends and I did a lot of drugs and I was in and out of rehabs and I had plenty of drug overdoses, near-death occasions, suicide attempts. I've spent many nights in mental health hospitals. I've been diagnosed with everything under the moon that you could think of.
Typically the phrase is under the sun, but...
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm kidding. Nancy and I have jokes back and forth about the funny way she words things sometimes, so it's cute, adorable, and endearing. So
it's a known thing in my family, yes, that I say things that are funny. Anyway, but yeah, so it went through, but then around 2015, I will say that's when the transgender ideology started kind of like really picking up, and I never really thought about the idea of being a man before that all happened. It was actually a slow burn in a weird way in my head. And I remember it initially started with the pronoun movement. Like everybody was all of a sudden asking people like what their pronouns were. And even back then, though, in the very beginning, though, it wasn't, not everybody was asked their pronouns. It was just the people who sort of look like it. And
well, before we get into too much detail on that, I do want to start with your childhood. But as I pointed out to you recently, and this was interesting to you, the trans movement really began to pick up after the Obergefell Supreme Court ruling about marriage, that basically legalized so-called homosexual marriage across the country. And I noticed, I was actually at a bachelor party that day for a friend of mine from a Christian fraternity. I remember crying that day because I just thought it was such a catastrophe. Our country was, kind of shaking its fist at God and saying, you design marriage one way, well, we're going to redesign it. And, as if we could do that. And, but I remember it felt like the trans movement and all that, picked up immediately. And we'll get into more detail on that, but why don't we start, you had mentioned earlier on in your childhood, like just starting with the beginning, so people kind of have a sense of background before they get into, the later stuff. You had said pretty early on, there was a sense of separation from Christ and separating from church or whatever. So yeah, why don't you just start with the childhood, and go from there?
I mean, what specifically, if you have any, because there's a lot, I could go into,
it's your story.
The separation,
you say what you want.
The separation I felt in church really was, I was going through a lot of things as a child that nobody really knew I was going through.
Yeah.
So the first would be like I was exposed to sexual things way too young, through an experience I had with somebody in our family.
Yeah.
Not in our immediate family, but in our blood family nonetheless.
Yeah.
Where I was, I don't know how you'd say, I don't like saying, I was sexually touched too young. Sure. And, made
we can
to
leave it at that
participate
for the audience
in things. Yeah. And so anyway, I think with that, there was a lot of confusion. Also, there was a lot of, I remember hearing like key things in church, and it's funny because I don't actually have a very good memory. Looking back, my memory is quite terrible.
Yeah.
But one of the things I remember was, I remember feeling like I caught on to some key ideas in church. And some of those key ideas were even just this is how the devil is so like manipulative, because, in church, I remember, things that are quite good to, in nature to say, like for instance, like no sex before marriage, but that in a child's mind could be manipulated by the devil, to mean, now I'm this young kid and I have this, secret that I can't share with anybody, that, I have, these things that are happening to me behind closed doors that I can't talk about. And, but in my head, it's like, well, that I've already done those things. Those things have already happened to me. So I already feel like a sinner. I'm already screwed.
Yeah.
And not even that, but I felt, it really drove a wedge between what I believed God could feel about me, because, it really was the beginning of my, I had such little confidence even back then, and like the fact that I could even be loved by God, because I was like, man, I've already done all these things, like, and these things have already happened. And then I have, confusion about, it's a lot to go through, but essentially that was part of where it I would say where it started. And, then I would say also as time went on around third grade, I started having, I remember my very first crush, where I knew I was having same-sex attraction was, with my third grade teacher. And, I specifically remember that. And, at the time, like as a kid, you don't really know why your brain is operating the way it is, why it's doing. It makes sense to me now that I I was looking for like leaning into motherly figures, who, brought me a sense of safety, but when you're a kid and you're developing and, those certain, wires get crossed and you get confused about certain things. It was at a really pivotal time, of my maturity. And so I think it makes sense as to how those things get confused. And, but then that enters the picture, and then it's like, now you're terrified because that you've heard at church that now this thing's wrong, and you're like, I just can't catch a break.
Yeah.
But also, in church, the main theme that I remember picking up from growing up in a Protestant church was, and this is really where I started to spiral, was, that sin, the temptation of sin, in itself was a sin.
Yeah.
Just having a temptation towards these things was a sin. And that's, imagine, just imagine like putting yourself in that position. Any temptation that you have that is that is inclined towards this like disordered passion, which we now understand, is there's no separating yourself from it. So it's like, what am I supposed to do? Like, that is not only is it like a breeding ground for people to just give up altogether, because it's like, well, if I'm already accused of this thing, I might as well just live it and have a little bit of sense, because the truth is that like at the core of like these disordered affections, and at least in my story, the core of it was I was still looking for love.
Yeah.
Because if you go back earlier in my story, you can see very early on how I already felt like God couldn't love me, but we're wired for love. So I still tried to find it in other areas, in other ways.
Yeah.
And so obviously if I'm, already thinking that I'm like completely beyond repair, I'm going to go towards the thing that that can bring at least the most amount of comfort for what I was dealing with. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If I'm already damned, well, at least this brings a little comfort and makes me feel a little bit loved. And so I'm going to go towards this.
Yep.
And that's kind of how that happened. And, it blew me away, obviously, later on when I became Catholic and I got catechized, and that I understood all the differences in, that temptations are just, they're just disordered passions. And
they're part of the fallen nature we inherited from Adam. But they're not
the original sin.
It's not it, because we fell from grace, and grace is what allowed our lower passions to be aligned with reason. And so those passions, yes, are not fully submitted to reason, because we still have the body inherited from Adam in that state. But ultimately we choose. And the church teaching is that sin and righteousness are in the will, and which again is not the temptation. Yeah, and this issue of temptation itself being a sin versus not being a sin, we won't go into it right now, really, but this was something that actually Martin Luther confused, and Martin Luther, claimed that concupiscence itself, which is those disordered passions, that itself was sin. Whereas the church teaches, no, that's not sin itself. It's a result of sin. It's a result of our fall. But just simply having a disordered temptation, or a temptation at all, is not sin. Surely, even in a sense, Christ was tempted in the desert. We're in the middle of Lent, and it's kind of based on Christ going into the desert for 40 days. This wouldn't have been a disordered temptation, because Christ didn't have any disordered temptations. But surely he, in his human nature, he was tempted to eat, right? Because he was hungry, We know that in the garden, he was tempted not in a way that he would ever defect from the Father, but he asked that the cup that God had assigned to him to be taken away. But he said at the end of the day, not my will, but yours be done. And so it was in the will. So anyway, it's just this issue is deep in Protestantism. And yes, it proved to be very very damaging. This is where, these theological differences matter. There are plenty of Catholics who don't know their faith, and so they live horrible lives and whatever. But when you actually understand that the differences, the church helps us make these very important distinctions. We're glad that you know the truth now, but of course at the time it just created years and years of confusion.
Well, and also I want to really stress the point of this, how important these distinctions are, not just in the sense of like even Protestantism, but realistically, look, when we talk about the idea of the temptation being the sin itself, we know that temptation is a part of, we're gonna experience it. Like, that's unavoidable. It's unavoidable. And so when it's unavoidable, when you are being when who you are is basically the sin, that's the basis for the entire in my opinion, so far, for all the identity issues that we see in the world.
Yep.
Because our identity now is going in this weird direction where we're being identified as our sin.
Yeah.
And people actually believe that, though. That's the thing. Because, like, for instance, when people say, and I actually, for the longest time, especially kids who experience same-sex attraction from a very young age, which, by the way, you don't need to be, sexually abused to experience this. There's plenty of other avenues for same-sex attraction to occur. I have my own theories about how, a lot of it relates back to, certain things with the family, which we know, the family's under significant attack.
Yeah.
But, there's pornography. There's so many avenues to this same-sex attraction.
When kids experimenting after they see pornography. We knew multiple kids in our lives. We'll keep details to a minimum because we want to be modest. But there were kids that you knew that there was sexual activity with, even after that initial abuse that you suffered at the hands of one of our extended family members. And so, when kids see these things, they imitate it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. Well, and the thing is like when people say like, I kind of feel like some of the vitriol from even like this like wall, it seems, that kind of abruptly stops the communication or effective communication, I would say, rather, between like what we know as the gay community and maybe even like a Christian community of people, is that you'll see that there's a lot of hurt on the gay side because there is this idea that like, because I think the one thing is they've already confused this temptation with who they are. You hear many of them talk about it. They're like, I was born this way. God made me this way because, and I think this is so critical, it's because they've been made to believe that having a temptation, they can't see themselves outside of the temptations they face. And that was huge for me. Like when I go back in time and I think about it, I mean, what a painful position to be in, to have these things that are happening to you and inside of you that you can't control, but you can, if somebody would have like, I don't know how my life would be different, but I imagine that if somebody had given me the understanding of and the distinction between temptation and my will, and understanding where this temptation and this, concupiscence comes from, and how, like, where we, like, our heritage, like where we come from, why we struggle the way we do. I mean, geez, there's no hate in that message.
No.
You know what I mean? I couldn't come up with a message of hate or I wouldn't have felt like less than, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because, of if the truth had been, made known. And so it's really sad because a lot of people really struggle with that. They'll shut down the idea of Christ simply because they see this temptation, this disordered passion as who they are.
Yeah.
And they've been made in many ways to feel that way by flawed theology.
Yeah, it's it's a really interesting point. I understood it more abstractly when I was studying Luther more, and then comparing what he was saying with what the Catholic bishops and the Pope and whatnot were saying at the time. Say, no, that's not correct. And obviously there were more issues than just this concupiscence issue, but and of course, there are many fine Protestants who, with us, acknowledge the sinfulness of homosexual behavior. But yes, you're exactly right. This confusion of a desire or a temptation with the sin itself. Again, the Church doesn't say there's no sin involved, in the sense that, yes, we have those passions because of original sin, because of the damaged nature we received from Adam and Eve. So it's related to sin in that way. But we struggle against it. Paul talks about you can sow in the Spirit and reap life, or you can sow in the flesh and reap death. And the flesh doesn't mean our body just as our body. It means the disordered passions that our bodies are continue to be subject to. One quick little theology thing, just so everybody knows, Nancy actually requested me to butt in more because she felt that it would help with like questions or whatever. So, but this is actually a really important point and we'll get into the natural law stuff as well later. I do want you to cover more of your like teenager years and your adolescence and all that. But just a quick point here is that the Church teaches that Adam and Eve were created in a state called original justice, Now, why is it called justice? Because justice is the virtue by which we give to each what they are due. And so when it comes to original justice, it meant that Adam and Eve were constituted such that they could offer to God what he was due. And they were born, but that was only possible because they were in what the church calls a state of grace. And so what did grace do? Grace is God's divine life in the soul. And so what did grace enable Adam and Eve to be? The state of original justice was their mind, through the power of grace, was submitted to God. Their lower passions, so food, sex, pleasure, power, money, fame, whatever it is, are submitted to reason, because it's submitted to their brain, their reason. And then the body was submitted to the soul. And so when they fell, all three of those things fell apart. Their reason was no longer submitted to God, their passions were no longer submitted to their reason, and their body was no longer submitted to their soul, which is why eventually it separates. And that's the definition of death, is the separation of body and soul. And so we inherited that. And when we are baptized, we are reborn. And what does God do? I mean, Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. God comes back to live in our souls. And so what does that do? It allows our mind to be submitted to God, but our bodies are still damaged from Adam and Eve because we haven't received our new bodies yet. We don't receive a new soul, but we receive, our beloved and our Creator back into our soul. So in that sense, the mind can be restored to submitting to God. But we still have our bodies. We don't get those back until after the resurrection. And so that body that we have is still subject to the disordered passions. However, because our reason is now submitted to God, our reason, and this is what we're doing during Lent, we are training and habituating ourselves to have our reason exercise mastery over our lower passions. And that's so when Paul talks about we're like athletes training for the crown, and talks about sowing in the spirit versus and reaping life, and sowing in the flesh and reaping death. That's what he's talking about. Lent is we should be doing this throughout our whole life, right? But especially during Lent, we are sowing in the spirit, which means the mind that's been transformed by God, we are putting that in control and saying no to our lower passions. So anyway, we can get into that a lot, but that's it really emphasizes everything you're saying, that to the extent many people who identify as gay identify as such, it is rooted in I think you're completely right, it's rooted in a theological error. And that error comes directly from Protestantism. It comes directly from Luther. Did Luther intend for it to go to the extent it's gone? No, he didn't. But at the root of it, it is a theological error, an inability to distinguish a temptation to something with the sin itself. So anyway.
Ooh, that's heavy stuff. I mean, look at how much damage is created, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Because when you're on this side of things, I mean, our Lord's really helped me understand this in a big way. I love to sit with him in adoration, and I think that's really helped me a lot.
We've made it part of your job description, right?
Yes, because I was.
You don't need it to be part. You'd go anyway, right? But it's like no, you are going to go to adoration for you and for Eternal Christendom. So yeah. Kind of the best job ever in some ways. So
right.
Yeah.
That's funny actually. What was I going to say? But
being on the other side.
Being on the other side, when you really go back, and this is actually a huge grace that we can get into when I talk about how I had my miraculous conversion at the parish at the Mass
on this day,
but.
2 years ago?
Well, not this day, March 19th, yeah.
Well, that's the day, that's the day we're posting this. So on this day that we're posting this, 2 years ago, right? But don't get too far ahead, because I want people to know what's leading up to all that. So, but yeah.
Yeah. No, but what I was going to say is just that I received a really huge grace, and one of the graces that I received, which I'm grateful for beyond words, is that instantly one of the things I realized was that the church was right in all of her teachings. And so the one thing I have not ever struggled with, and I'm really grateful for this, is accepting church teaching. And so and that doesn't mean that I understood church teaching right away. I want to make that distinction. Like, I very much had questions that didn't make sense to me. But if the church said, well, this is how we see it, I said, okay. And I recognized that I was the flawed one and the church wasn't. And if, God would help me understand in time. And so far that's been the case.
I want us to dig into that when we get to that point in the story, because it's so important.
Sure.
And you and I have talked about this, but yeah, let's go from childhood. You have that crush with your third grade teacher. So just start from there and just keep going forward, chronologically, if you don't mind.
I mean, I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot that I remember. I have a really choppy memory of our childhood. Okay. There's not a lot I remember that stands out too much beyond just the fact that I would say this, the biggest thing, the big through thread in our entire childhood all the way through, college and the rest of my life was that I lived in daily. The only thing I really remember, and this is part of the reason why I think I actually have no memory of a lot of things, is because I was in a constant state of fight or flight, because every single day, the only thing at the forefront of my mind was, don't get found out today. And I remember waking up every single day just terrified that, is today going to be the day I lose my family? Because it wasn't just about like, I know I'm not going to say anything about what I'm going through, but in my head, and now that we understand the nature of spiritual warfare, which I didn't understand at the time, I had these thoughts that just like, we're just like, your family doesn't love you. And you remember, I was a pretty bad kid in the sense of like, not honoring our father and mother. I mean, I fought with our mother like all the time. But a lot of that fighting was rooted in this fear, which almost created a resentment.
Don't reject me.
Right. And a resentment based on the belief that the rejection was inevitable.
Yeah.
If she knew the truth, which wasn't true.
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. And so it created a huge division in our home. I mean, our home was I argued with, and it's funny too, because I loved our parents like the most. Like sure. It's like, they're the last people you would think that like that kind of level of fighting would occur with, but it really came because I loved them so much. And so, which just sounds so weird to say, but
not really. I mean, the people closest to us can hurt us the most. And we love them most, but they can also hurt us the most. So, Well,
and I was most fearful of their rejection,
sure.
Which is where a lot of this anger sort of came up. But anyway, as time moved on,
let me make a quick point there. Even before your conversion, when you came out, as it were, to both our mom and dad, neither of them responded that way. They didn't change their views about something being, behavior being sinful or not. But they didn't reject you. There was still a relationship there. And so, in many ways, I think there's a lot of, I think there are some parents out there who would, and I think that should be reexamined. They shouldn't. So that is real. But I do think most parents, even if they hold the line morally, wouldn't reject their children.
But this is interesting. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned this, because this is also another really important thing. This goes back to the flawed view of identifying ourselves as our temptations. This is, identity issues, because if our identity really comes from being children of God, and God is our identity, then we have none of these issues that I'm talking about now. But the second your focus gets off God, and you start to see your identity, especially as your sin, or as your sin, I would rather as your identity. This brings up another really important aspect, is that even though mom and dad didn't reject me and there was still a relationship, mom would always explain and that she didn't agree, but that she loved me. Yeah. That was like, and I know so many parents who have this story. It's like, I told her I loved her, but I don't agree. And there's so much anger in that. Why? Because once again, if that person believes that they are this thing, then even if you say I love you, but I don't accept this, you're still saying, and their ears, you're still saying I don't accept you, which then the whole I love you after that follows is very confusing to accept as well, because you're like, you don't accept me, but how could you love me if you don't accept me? So this is where it feels fake. Yeah, it feels really fake, and then it's just I've seen it rip through so many parents' lives, including our own mother. I mean, now I look back, and I've thankfully since been able to apologize to our mother and explain sort of some of the confusion I was going through, but and why I felt the way I felt. But I mean, imagine being a parent and hearing for so long like that, you know, your parent, you say I love you to your child, and your child just like says no you don't, like you don't love me, you know. And then we wonder why when they get of age they leave the confines of the home and they run to a vile community of people that say you know, love
you
is
should
love,
separate
and,
from your
you know,
parents.
Yeah,
Some of
well,
them
and
even
I
say
want to
that.
say, that I want to make a distinction that when I say vile, I mean ideologically.
Sure.
I think there are many really good-hearted people
Absolutely.
who are in the persuasions of like confusion, just like I was.
Yep.
And so I don't mean that in the sense that people themselves are vile, but just the cesspool of confusion and chaos that you end up going into. And you know, there are actually some pretty vile people, I would agree with that statement, who you can see are in many ways very evil, and almost seem to thrive off that. So there's definitely a spectrum of that in the communities that I'm talking about. But my point is that if you're going and you're leaving the home and a place where you've always felt like you weren't enough, you're being set up just to run right into the arms of people who are like, just be who you are. Yeah. And now all of a sudden you're hearing be who you are. And the person you think you are, which is this disordered passion, this disordered temptation, that's, if you think that's who you are, well, yeah, it's gonna feel like a huge relief to finally be around people who accept that.
Well, you know, you're actually becoming deeply Catholic when you keep saying I need to make a distinction because it's so true. Funny. It's just you know, many of the great saints, St. Thomas Aquinas, Catholic theology is so it's so simple at its core, but it's so deep and complex given all the problems that the church has pondered for now 2,000 years, that it can get into these things in great detail. And so, but when you get into things in detail, it's important to use precise language because, you know, as Deacon Harrison Garlick, he's on our advisory board, and we've interviewed him as well. He's a convert as well. Grammar precedes logic, meaning the words we use precede how we think, because we use words to think. And so there's obviously a mutual relationship between the two. Because when God created Adam, you know, he said, start naming things. So Adam clearly had some notion of language right from the beginning. It's very mysterious how that all happened. So there's clearly a relationship between grammar and logic, but the words we use, that's why people in many of these ideological camps, they first try to change the language, because they know that changing the language will change the thought. A quick point based on what you said. It's, well, two things. One, I grew up a musician, and so I was around people who identified as gay all the time. High school, college, etc. And I was fine with them. That's the thing. I mean, we had some other family members who identified that way. I never treated them any differently. I mean, if they want me to approve of what they're doing in their bedrooms, no, that's not going to happen.
Right.
But but it was, you know, there was I won't say his name, but a guy in high school who I was playing the piano for our high school musical. You know, a guy in the theater program who was very, obviously, gay. I'll just put it that way, as far as how he identified. And every time I saw him, I'd give him a big old hug and say, "Hey, Bob." His name's not Bob, but "Hey, Bob," and he gave me a hug, and it was all good. Like, it was like, it just, and I was probably the most conservative religious person I knew in my high school, and it was just like, it never struck me like, why would I treat this person badly? I mean, I'm not going to approve of what they desire me to approve of, but there's no reason to treat them badly.
Well, I think, I like that you said this actually, because I think oftentimes when we talk about this theological error, which as we unpack this more, it's becoming more and more evident how destructive this one theological error has been. But I think people are under the idea that it's only the gay person, or excuse me, I'm currently working on my changing my language.
Your grammar.
To refer to only as same-sex attraction, because takes some getting used to, though, because I've spent many years.
That's why I keep saying those
language.
who identify as gay instead of gay people.
Yes. For sure.
I might as well say glutton people. For people who struggle with food, or somebody who struggles with alcohol, like they're all those alcohol people. Or drunks.
Sure, but I think that's often understood that it's only an issue for the person who has same-sex attraction to see this as an identity. But I don't think that's true. I don't think that the people who have same-sex attraction are the only people who confuse this temptation with their identity. I think actually many Christians who also buy into this theology, which is why you don't see people giving charity to people of that. Because if you have people who are within a Christian movement, and this isn't all Protestants, by the way.
Sure.
I know most Protestants I know are insanely awesome people who are always kind. In fact, actually, one of them specifically, who I won't name because I don't know if she'd want me to, but played a huge role many years in advance talking to God about me way before my conversion. So there's that, and
we're very thankful for that.
Absolutely.
We received many gifts as Protestants. We see where things were problematic and where it wasn't the fullness of the faith that Christ revealed, but we received, particularly myself, because I didn't have some of the abuse things that you had early on. So, which, made it much easier for me by the grace of God, right? Not because of anything in me, but I had many wonderful gifts as a Protestant that, as I say, the two greatest ones are a belief that the Bible is God's word and perfect and divinely inspired, etc., and that truth is real and the same for everybody, and it's one. And ultimately, those two things led me straight to the Catholic Church. And so I can't despise, many of my Protestant family members and friends who taught that to me in good faith and didn't know any better as far as the, lies and misrepresentations about the Church. And many of them have become Catholic now because they believed in these principles they received as Protestants, and now many of them have or are in the process of coming to the Church that Christ actually established. So,
yeah. Well, and once again, I think that there are some people who lack charity towards people who have these types of temptations or live in these styles or succumb to these temptations. I think a lot of those people sometimes live in the error of also seeing this as an identity. So they see the person as this thing. And you'll see there's been plenty of people who have engaged with me online who you can see believe that they believe that the temptation is the sin. So that is still not all Protestants believe it. But a lot still do. And so that exists. But
one quick anecdote, I don't know if I've ever told you. When I was in college, I was in a Christian fraternity. I was Protestant obviously at the time. Although it's funny, I had a few Catholics who were trying to get me to be open-minded, and I wasn't open. I've since apologized to them. But anyway, there were at least two of the guys. I was president of the fraternity at some point. I was one of the founders of it. And, so people tended to come to me with all sorts of issues, and I had at least one or two come to me and say that they struggled with same-sex attraction, and they felt they could talk with me about it. And again, no one's been in any doubt my entire life that I'm religious and very conservative, So for whatever reason, they felt they could tell me about that. And I was compassionate. I said, hey, I so respect that you had the bravery to tell me that. I know it's very uncomfortable, and I'll be praying for you, and, stay strong and not acting on those temptations. And that's great. But then there was one time when a lot of the fraternity guys were together, including this person. And, there was banter back and forth with certain words referring to people who identify as gay that, sometimes happens, but was hurtful. And that person was there. And when that word was used, I'm avoiding it just for any YouTube issues. Sure. But when that word was used, I saw them and their eyes kind of went, they got sad. I could tell they were sad.
Oh.
And it wasn't because, probably because of the identity issue, kind of like they probably had something very similar, but also just because it emphasized why they felt they couldn't be open about their struggle. And maybe they could have with some of those guys. I think they could have, but when those sorts of words were used, it implied other. So I actually said out loud, they were all playing video games and going back and forth. I actually said out, because I was kind of angry, because I knew what was going on. I didn't point it out, of course. I didn't want to expose that person. I kept their privacy intact. But I said something to the effect of, by what sin, or maybe it was, no, by what temptation should I call you?
Yeah.
So, and I got very quiet after that, because I was present at the time. So like when I was that angry, I rarely got that angry. And people were like, oh my. So anyway, that was just, I hadn't thought of that anecdote. I don't know if I'd ever told you that, but
yeah. Well, and that's actually it's one other thing I'd like to say is that, there's plenty of ways that the temptations lead to this one particular one of same-sex attraction. And sometimes, like, there's literally so many ways that it can develop.
Yeah.
And with that being said, I think it's really important that even people who are being brought up in a very well catechized Catholic home probably have the best chance of defeating their children from going down a path like this, even if they do struggle. Because one thing that has shocked me actually since coming in the church is that there are a lot of people who actually live quite faithful Catholic lives who have never succumbed to the temptations, but have had them.
Yep.
And I think what is the determining factor of that? Well, probably catechesis, knowing your faith, the thing is if I had a child, because I don't know the exact way in which the devil might trick that child into having certain disordered passions or
arousing
how that may come about.
Passions. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Because I don't know that, if my child was starting to have those thoughts and feelings, man, I would say if there's one thing I wish I had as a kid, I wish I had not felt unsafe to be able to share that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. That's a tricky thing to do, though, because there's so much shame around this particular sin that I think, but when things live in the dark, they fester in the dark and they grow in the dark and they get worse and worse. I'd much rather have a child who understands the Catholic teaching and who is open about this so I can share with them, the belief and what is actually happening. Like share the distinctions of like, this is just temptation and this is, and living a faithful, we've talked about this, you and I off screen, obviously, is like, one of the things I'm working on now is like, working on diving really deeply into the virtues. Yeah. Because, those are the things that ultimately, help you have the will they strengthen your will to be able to not succumb to temptations. And the more you practice those virtues, which is where the ascetical life comes in, and things like that. But anyway, those can almost beat some of these things into submission. Well,
because of virtue, people often think of virtue as just like a good deed itself. A good deed is virtuous, right?
Right.
But a virtue is a habit, meaning it's a disposition of the soul. So what's a habit? A habit is when we're presented with some sort of stimuli, what we instinctively do first. That reveals our habits, which is why fasting is so important. As you and I have talked about, that when we fast, when our stomachs hurt, or we feel very hungry, maybe we get a headache, there's all sorts of things we'll turn to, and we find out very quickly, what do I turn to first? And that reveals the habit we have. And so, but when we realize that, we choose with our will, we perceive with our intellect, and we choose with our will, I'm going to habituate myself to this. And it's reading scripture or praying or going to adoration or whatever it may be. One point I wanted to make really quick, we didn't grow up in a perfect household, but I do want to give a lot of credit to our parents. They weren't perfect. We were, obviously, but no, I'm kidding. But both of our parents didn't get themselves what they gave us. And there can be a deep love and appreciation for that in the midst of the imperfections as well. So I do think it's important for people to know that, because we're going to honor our parents. We're not going to reveal, any of the things that, families shouldn't talk about publicly. but I can say in all truthfulness that there were many aspects of our childhood that were quite good, a whole lot better than both of our parents received from their family backgrounds. And, I think, how would you reflect on, well, let me add one more thing, because I want you to reflect on all of this. I mean, my perception of you growing up was, you were quite difficult sometimes. We could all be difficult. I had shouting matches with Mom on occasion when I was a teenager.
Yeah. Sure.
I've had to work on my temper over the years. I'm still very much working on the virtue of patience. I'm not the most patient person sometimes. So, I was not perfect either. And so I have a feeling I just saw the end of a facial expression that I was looking this way at. So the audience saw it before I did. So I wasn't perfect either, but I mean, in light of you were describing as like there was this defensiveness and like I will be discovered, and it was like that makes a lot of sense. But it was also, I think you would acknowledge now, in many ways, it was distorting how you were viewing reality.
Oh yeah, no, and that's actually, it's funny because one of the first things I remember doing once I kind of had this like realization of all these things, I've since not only apologized to our parents for the ways in which I misunderstood, their love for me and but also I thanked them actually. And this is something, when I tell you how crazy this is, you just have to trust me, because there's never a time in my previous life that I would say that, I would have ever thought this would be something I'd thank my parents for, because it was just such a source of pain for me in the time because of my misunderstanding about what was going on. But I've since thanked both our father and our mother for never conceding to what they knew to be true. So, for instance, like for loving
not
me,
conceding on what?
Oh, not conceding. Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
But yeah, because my mom, like, for instance, I remember the topic of like marriage had come up, and my misunderstanding of what marriage was. By the way, most people, I think, probably just think, and this is how I felt when it came to marriage, and we could talk about this in a second, but marriage was just something like, which you hear a lot of people talk about, like, it was just something the government did so under that, I didn't know that marriage was the, union of a man and woman, aimed towards the creation of human life. Like that's not how I viewed it, because I didn't have the context of religion and, sharing that and all that stuff. And so it wasn't that deep to me. I just saw it as like, well, people go down to the courthouse, they have, shared taxes, they can, things like that.
Benefits.
So in that regard, it really didn't make a lot of sense why gay marriage couldn't be the thing. But long story short, going back to Mom, I remember having a conversation where I asked her if she would, would she be at my wedding?
Oh. Yeah.
And she said she doesn't. I think in the beginning, to be honest, she struggled. She didn't give me a yes or a no. But I think the pause is what's beautiful. I think there was something in her that was like, I can't say yes to this.
Yeah.
But I'm also like looking at my daughter, who I can see is broken, and I don't want to hurt her either. So I can't. So I'm struggling to say no. Yeah. So just not even saying anything. But then eventually she did say. She never said yes. Yeah. That's the thing. She never said she would be at my wedding. Yeah. And eventually she did say she couldn't be there. And that utterly destroyed me at the time. But what I'm super grateful for now, and since I've thanked them for this, is that imagine the strife that a mother, I see it so clearly now. I couldn't see.
No, nothing to apologize for.
I mean, it hurt her so much to say that.
It did.
And then I couldn't see that love. But there's so many parents who, because that's such a hard thing to say, because that is a difficult spot for any parent to be in, they lead their kids right down the path to hell, because they can't stomach that pain, or they want their children to feel better. The source of so many issues these days, how we feel.
Yeah.
Anyway, and And my parents, now that I'm on this side of things, like understanding how much of how painful that was for her to say that and for her to still do that, but also do it with love. My mom was never somebody who was like, no, you're disgusting. You know what I mean? She never once gave me the impression that she thought differently of me, but my brain was so fractured. And this is like where I think in many ways, the darkening of our intellects, really happens, with sin. Things are harder and harder. The more you sin, the more you're inclining your will to sin and to feel more comfortable in that path. And it becomes harder and harder to reorder yourself to what is true. And that naturally darkens. Well, you start yeah, it's really messed up. It's a really bad place to be. Yeah. But because you yourself cannot see the truth, like in that moment. That's why it's so difficult. But anyway,
the example I give,
sorry.
No, that's beautiful, and you're right. I mean, it was hard for her. I saw the other side of it, and it was very difficult. But praise God, we're not there anymore.
Thank God. Yeah, absolutely.
And you've become such a wonderful source of encouragement and wisdom to all of us now. There was something you said that. I just wanted to make a comment that for people to understand how and why this can become so destructive is, so the church teaches that our soul has two primary powers. There's others, but I'll just focus on these two, the intellect and the will. And the intellect is how we know the truth, and the will is how we choose to follow it or not follow it. And so by God's grace in our souls, we're enabled to keep those two aligned, intellect, will, and with the truth up here, right? So sin is what happens when, let's say our intellect, it's seeing God, but then our will is like going a little bit that way. So there's a little bit of a split. And as you go forward with that, it starts splitting further. And then your intellect eventually, if you don't adjust the will, it starts bending that way. And then you see they're no longer going up to God, right? And then eventually, like that. That's essentially how it works. It's a rough illustration, but that's how it works. And so the issue, I mean, there's many issues, but one of them with this whole identifying yourself with your temptations is there's no objective standard anymore for behavior. There's no objective way to identify if your desires are right or wrong. I mean, implicitly, it's amoral, because if it's your desires, well, then what checks your desires? And then when you apply, because if you have this sort of bubble in one part of your life, meaning my sexual desires, right, and whatever's in that bubble is just who I am, right? We can't operate like that as human beings. We can't silo things off. So eventually that way of thinking starts affecting other things or starts infecting other things. So it's like, well, I mean, I think we're seeing the logic of this with, some of the ways we're approaching health now, where people who are clearly not healthy in their weight or whatnot, we're saying, you're perfect as you are, or this sort of health thing won't actually cause you problems and heart attacks and increased chances of cancer and whatever. And so it's a sort of, which is based on desires for food and desires to be, to be perceived as beautiful and in an equal way as, somebody else. And so, but it's the extension of this way of thinking, which is really not thinking. It's very irrational, that what I desire is the measure of what I can and should do. And this is where, why don't you narrate some of the things? We don't have to go into all the details. You go into whatever detail you want, but just some of the things you went through with drugs and suicide, etc. But then how, let's get to right before you had your miraculous moment. The natural law, starting counseling, maybe even mention people like Jordan Peterson and Dennis Prager, who had a role in all this. So yeah, just cover all that. Because I think I want people to understand this natural, because it's related to what I'm talking about, of like that our natures have an order that we can perceive through reason You don't even need to be Catholic. You can perceive through a rightly ordered mind that these things are ordered a certain way. Anyway, so yeah, I'll get out of the way.
Yeah. No, so this is, I think, also touches on the whole, this is kind of like the further away from the light like you get, the more your feelings about things are what is the truth. That's why you hear the people talk about my truth versus an objective truth.
Yeah. The truth outside of us that we have to conform to, as opposed to the truth so-called inside of us that we try to force the world to align with us.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so, anyway, as time went on, obviously, for a while there, my whole life was just kind of a whirlwind. I mean, I started slow in college. I just started doing drugs because I think I was looking for things. I learned really quickly that if I, took something, well, it actually kind of started because, and I want to put in context, in high school and in your early childhood, I never once touched a drug. I was a 3-4 sport athlete.
Yeah. I don't think any of us did. None of us had any issues with anything like that.
I never snuck out to parties. I was a good kid in that regard. I was a really good kid. I worked hard at school, and things like that. And so
I'm sorry, can I make one super quick point? It's about related to what you said earlier about our parents not violating their conscience in regard to I do think that was something that rubbed off very much on all of us, all three of us. And I see it in our other beloved sister as well, that there's a sense of strong sense of right and wrong. And we want to stand with what is actually right, as opposed to just going along with a crowd and whatnot. I mean, we all have temptations, and obviously there was an extent to which you succumbed to, following crowds to a certain degree, but there was always that bit that stayed intact. So anyway, I think that came from our parents. Yeah. It's one of the great things about them. So
I would agree. Yeah. And I would say the only reason that I fell into a crowd later is because, once again, I want to point out the main theme of since I was very young was my identity is not in Christ. Therefore I am looking for my identity in everything else in the world. Well, when you have needs like things like love and you want to be, accepted and things like that, your ability to fall into bad things, because at that point in my life, I had no care in the world who or what you were. My thought was, I'm already a terrible person. I feel terrible on the inside. I feel unlovable because even my family can't love me, even though that was a lie, obviously, but that's what I believed at the time, even though no one ever gave me evidence to make that, true. I deeply felt...
We didn't know the struggle.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and I deeply felt that. And so as a result, I wanted to feel love so much. And I basically I had no interview process for what made somebody a good enough person in my eyes to be a part of my life. So if you pretty much walking in front of me was all you needed for me to accept who you were, because I just wanted you to accept who I was. Yeah. There was no criteria anymore. And so when I got into college, I mean, I just got mixed up with all sorts of different things. It started with partying, and all of a sudden I felt this freedom, because now I'm also connecting, I was a good kid. I never partied. I never did anything. But now, if you guys don't even love me, I'm just going to do all this stuff. Yeah. Because I feel like, you almost feel like gypped in a weird way. I remember at the time thinking I'm finally going to experience the things. And this is where I think sometimes it's silly now to think about, but a lot of people do feel like you hear people talk about the patriarchy and things like that. There's this I wouldn't have described it then, because I think I'm the generation before all this stuff really became a belief system for people. But I started, but it is kind of the similar idea, was that you guys held me down, you guys controlled me, all these false beliefs, so I'm gonna now do things my way, and I'm gonna get into these things. But mostly it was because I needed community, and I wanted to feel loved, and it led me down a lot of dark paths because I had no
objective standard. Right.
Whatsoever. Yeah. And so it led to very quickly, it led to, but also feeling ruled my life. I wanted to feel good because I just never, when I wasn't like high or messed up on something, I did not feel good. I was so broken. I was so utterly uncomfortable with everything in my life that I just, I couldn't cope. And so that led me to being an addict pretty quickly. And anyway, I led to many years of overdoses. I mean, I remember, but this is another time where our dad, you know what I mean? Like I had already shunned our dad at the time, and wasn't talking to him, but he, kept wanting to talk to me, and I had overdosed and ended up in the hospital. My drug dealer at the time had found me passed out downstairs, and he took me to the hospital and dropped me off basically. And I ended up in the ICU. I woke up the next day in the intensive care unit, hooked up to all these wires and heart monitors and whatever. Yeah. And a breathing thing or whatever. And the only person there was Dad, because Mom was in another state at the time. She was traveling. Yeah. But the only person that showed up for me was my dad. And I yelled him out of the room. I remember that. That was really,
I was in another state too, just so people know. If I was there, I would have been there too.
Yeah, no, it's true. But so anyway, my point is that the people I thought wouldn't be there for me were actually the only consistently there for me people. That I didn't say that very well, but anyway. I know what you mean. So anyway, but yeah, as time went on, things went on. I really want to make note of the fact that this whole idea of not having an objective standard, but also the idea of your own feelings being what's true. Because as time went on, the transgender movement started to pick up, and all of a sudden I'm being asked.
About 2015, Obergefell, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Which is funny, actually. You mentioned that to me the other day of what year that was, and it actually shocked me. I hadn't really put that together, that it was right when gay marriage was. But that makes sense, because it makes sense that, because I really don't think that had I not been, had I not identified myself as being gay first and self-identified that way, I don't know that I personally would ever have gotten into the transgender movement. I think naturally things progress, sin progresses, but also my identity, my shattered identity was progressing. And I thought, I was just coming out of a bad breakup with somebody that I very much cared for. Yeah. And as a result of that, I actually... It's a really complex topic to discuss, the whole trans movement, and what I've learned since about how I ended up there. But the other thing I'd like to mention too, sorry, this goes back to childhood, but I also want to make a point that I was very, very uncomfortable with my femininity. Yeah. That I, in many ways, do think was connected to what happened to me as a child sexually, because it almost seems that everything moving forward in my life became sort of a costume to kind of keep me safe from those things. Now, my brain didn't put that together, but one thing I started realizing only since trying to practice virtue and being Catholic and working on some of these other things and a little bit more is I was sharing with you the idea of dressing feminine still was really difficult for me. It's not like when I had my moment where I realized God was real that all these things just fell into place. I didn't. Yeah. I still wanted to have my head buzzed. I still wanted to,
some of the most intimate aspects of your femininity were violated.
Yeah.
They were violated and abused by others. And so, while there was a disordered direction that went in, the fear and the thing you were responding to itself makes sense,
Yeah.
Whatever that was violated, I don't want that violated again.
Exactly. Well, and that actually became very evident even later on in leaning more towards transgenderism, because the idea of being in positions that were more, I'm trying to talk about this stuff in a way that's modest. But to being in situations that are sexual in nature, it felt more safe to be seen as a man than it was a woman.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I distinctly remember having a lot of those feelings. And so I think the idea was, well, I can't really feel this way until I'm, there's a lot of other things that go into it. I'm still working on discerning through some of that.
Why don't you recall the whole counseling thing and how that eventually kind of broke you when the counsel, and if I'm skipping a few things that you feel you need to cover, then cover them. But I remember that being a really important moment of a counselor you went to get help. Well, I'll leave you to tell that story.
Yeah, so eventually I just started having, people were asking me for a long time about the pronoun stuff. I ended up eventually succumbing to it, giving myself like they, them pronouns, which is super embarrassing now, but
we've all done embarrassing
things.
It is. I had a 30-minute confession before I came into the church. So. I was they, them because I was too embarrassed to say he, him. And then eventually I ended up transitioning socially. I changed my name to Roman. I went by all these things. I was on the path. How long did that Roman thing last? Which I must say is hyper ironic in light of becoming Catholic now. So
I would say probably a year.
Really? Because I never called you Roman once. I don't recall you ever asking me to. I saw some things on social media, I think, but it was never something that I think I wouldn't have ever done that.
I think that's probably. So I didn't tell any of you guys.
Okay.
Which is weird because I remember there was a feeling of embarrassment. Like for some reason it was
silly.
like.
I'm sorry.
Well, it is silly, but at the time I still wanted to be called that. And so I remember my whole entire I was just, when I was working at Starbucks, that's when they only knew me as Roman.
Yeah.
So I was hired on as Roman, and it was actually towards the end when I had my miraculous conversion, and I wanted to be called by my regular name again.
Really? So the Roman thing stopped as you were having a miraculous conversion, the beginnings of it, to the Roman Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Funny.
Oh, yeah.
It's funny. That's what I was saying earlier. I can see the dots connecting.
God has a sense of humor.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, no, only like the people in our life that I knew would be supportive of it knew about it. So there are plenty of people in our family who knew about it. It just, you could probably...
So when you filled out a job application for Starbucks, did you put Roman, or because that wasn't your legal name? So did you...
No, so Starbucks is very woke, so you can actually put your preferred name and your preferred pronouns.
Okay.
So I had to, because legally I had not had a name change, I had to provide my legal documents with my dead name. As it were. And then but they only ever referenced me, so like my name tag was Roman. No one ever knew it was technically it was considered like a HIPAA thing, I think, for bosses to even reveal what my real legal name was.
And how did you come up with Roman?
That is a good question. I just always liked the name. It was really not that deep. I also have a Roman battle scene on my arm that's tattooed, which I don't know. It's not that deep, to be honest. I really liked it.
So fair enough. So let me recall a moment, and then we'll get up to this counseling thing, because I do want to get into the natural law thing. But I remember, I forget when exactly it was. It was after I gave you the catechism, because I came into the church in July 2019, July 13th to be precise, Saturday, Fatima Day. We didn't realize that when Father and I were scheduling it, but it turned out to be a Fatima Day. But you and I had a conversation where you had told me. You had gone to the hospital, I think, relatively recently, and had a heart scare. I forget exactly what it was, but it could have been bad. It was like a minor heart attack, I think, because of drugs or something. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So it was you were kind of thinking, I have another chance here.
I think you're referring to the time when I was I had another overdose.
Yeah.
I was when I want to say this is when I was on methamphetamine and also I was on Adderall.
Yeah. Okay.
I was on methamphetamine and Adderall, which actually the doctors told me with the amount of Adderall I had in my system along with methamphetamine that they didn't even know why I was alive.
Wow.
Like it didn't, like for one of those things, for just the Adderall amount alone that I had, which was like 4 times the like limit of any high end dose they'd give somebody, because I was just so addicted to it.
Wow.
That alone, because I was at a resting heart rate. I was at like almost like I was like 190 something.
Whoa.
Resting.
Whoa.
Like 185 or something like crazy like that.
Whoa.
Yeah. It was, and that's why I remember I said, well, I ended up walking outside of my apartment, and I actually had this really intensely aware moment of my morality.
Mortality.
I'm sorry. Yeah. See, this is a Nancy. This is the ism that my parents. Yeah, it's a Nancy moment. Everyone laughs. But yeah. So and so anyway, my point is that I remember thinking like, oh, I might die tonight.
As you're going to the hospital.
I wasn't going to the hospital yet. No, this is how it happened. Is I had gone outside. This is after 4 years of sobriety. Remember?
Yeah.
So like I actually had been clean for a while, and nobody knew that I had this blip and this mess up or whatever. Yeah. Actually, was this right after? Because I feel like it was a year later or something that I had my conversion. Yeah, I don't know when this was. If this is when you.
Well, I'm leading up to the tarot card thing when you told me you were experimenting with tarot cards and have been for a while. And my eyes got all big, and I was like, "Don't do that." And you took my admonition very seriously, actually. You know. Yeah. So anyway, that's what I'm leading up to. Not to skip too many things.
I get very confused on timelines, but we'll just for the sake of the story. What happened that night though is I ended up walking outside, and I have a big slab of concrete on in my apartment complex, and I laid down. It must have been like 8 or 9 o'clock at night, something enough where my mom was still awake. I know that because I called her. And I laid down on the ground, and my heart is beating out of my chest in a way that I'm like, any second I could be done. Yeah. And it's a very weird thing when you're about to die in all, respects, to be honest. And you have a chance to think about that. And you also know that you're at the mercy of whatever's going to happen, because there's nothing I could have done that would have stopped it. I literally just had to sit there and think, and thank God I didn't die. But I had a very unique experience that way. And but 2 things happened. One, I was so fearful. I was so ashamed to acknowledge and admit to anybody that I had messed up again. Yeah. Because that had been many years where I hadn't had that hiccup. And, so the only thing I wanted to do, and all I kept hearing was like, actually this was after. All I wanted to do was talk to my mom. I said, well, if I'm going out, I want to just hear my mom's voice one more time. Yeah. And so that was the real plan. The plan was, I'm going to call my mom, and she could probably tell you the story better that night. Because she was the one that got me to go to the hospital. So I called her, and I was like, I wasn't going to tell her what was going on. I just wanted to hear her voice. Mm-hmm. And I was like, hi, how are you doing? I just wanted to call you and say hi. And she knew right away something was not right. Yeah. And so she was like, what's wrong? Something's wrong. Something's not right. And I said, and then finally in my head, I was just like, do you really want to die? Like, you just need to tell her what's going on. And so I said, and I just bluntly said, Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm overdosing currently. I don't know what to do. Oh, I took some drugs again, and I took too much, I think. And she was like, you need to get to the hospital immediately. And that's when I got off the phone with her. She's like, no, get off the phone with me and go to the hospital right now. And so I got off the phone, and I'm still laying on the floor trying to get my heart rate to like somewhat calm down, and it's not. And that's when I kept hearing in my head, having this feeling like you're not going to get too many more of these opportunities. Yeah. You're not going to get too many more of these chances. And I just remember thinking like, that, and it was weird. And so that was what prompted me after my mom told me to go to the hospital. And I actually, she called me an Uber. I don't know why. Because my big thing is I didn't have any money, and I was like, I can't pay another medical bill. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, if I make it, great. If I die, well, then I don't want that bill to fall on anybody anyway. So let's just take an Uber. And the Uber got me there really quickly. Actually, he basically drove like it was an emergency, which good. I feel grateful to him for. But I also feel
that you were overdosing.
I said. I didn't say that. I just said I feel like I'm having a heart attack.
Oh, okay.
And
that's an emergency. Yeah.
And so he was really nice, and he drove me there very quickly, and we gave him a nice tip. But when I got to the hospital, that's when I ended up staying overnight, and they said I had a very minor cardiac infarct. I don't know what it's called. But anyway,
something like that. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah. But
it's like the equivalent of a minor heart attack.
Yeah, wow. That's what they said. That's how they described it. So anyway,
I think it was soon after that you were actually telling me this, and then you had mentioned using tarot cards, and I was like, because you had I remember you telling me that you felt that sense of you're not going to get many more chances at this, and you felt like you had to do something different. You weren't at the point of being open to Jesus or the Catholic faith, but at least not openly, but yeah, when I did tell you about no, don't use tarot cards, I remember I was happy you brought that up, because I was encouraged by how seriously you took my warning on that. You know.
Well, oddly, in a weird way, there's always like I violated my conscience, and this is actually really important about what we were talking about previously about like the violation of our conscience is something that almost is a good sign.
What do you mean?
To to know what's right and wrong.
Oh, okay.
Not that it's like the end all be all, but I'm just saying what I'm trying to say is I also think it's interesting that when I was doing tarot cards, so I was actually just doing tarot cards because I was just out of a bad breakup.
Yeah.
And when I say I was in the most heartbreak that I had ever been in my whole life, this was on the tail end of, this is right as COVID was happening. I now live alone, and the whole world shut down.
Yeah.
I work, 50 hours a week at Amazon, as a manager. So my whole life is either like supply chain management or coming home and just trying to like relax.
Yeah.
And so I'm stuck inside all day. Well, I found these YouTube channel videos that just were like giving you like, your horoscopes and like things like that. And what it did is I'll be honest, it gave me a little bit of comfort, because all I wanted to hear was like, oh, they're going to come back, or, oh, they're, you're going to find somebody else.
Things are going to turn out well.
This is right. And so I got addicted to them really quickly.
Yeah.
Because all I wanted to know was like, what's going to happen next? Well, because if I could know a little bit about what's happened next, I have something to look forward to.
Yeah. I
have something I could hang on for. And so, that's when I was doing those more and more. But when I say I had a violation of conscience, is that technically I didn't know they were occultish, but there was always something that felt like they weren't right.
Yeah.
I don't know how to describe that. And so I think that is an example of the violation of conscience.
You were perceiving
that even if
accurately.
You don't know. Right. Yeah. And so anyway, I kind of, innocently, I ended up buying a bunch of tarot cards. I started doing my own. They also use like really manipulative language, like, angel cards and things like that. And so I'm thinking like, angels.
Just different kinds.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. And so anyway, that's when I ended up telling you, like,
just so people know I'm referring to demons, fallen angels, just for anybody who may not.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, and so I ended up telling you one night that I was doing all these readings, and I had all these cards, and you said the seriousness in your voice, though, I think is what shook me out of it. I wasn't because we all know about demons. We may not know the right things about them, but like we grew up in a culture where we still have things, we still have images of what a demon might be, like when we watch things like The Exorcist or like, you know, so like, I knew a demon was nothing I wanted to mess with. And so when you said that, like, that's demonic, get rid of them. Because I told you, I said, these are angel cards, and you're like, those aren't angels, those are demons. Go home and you need to get rid of them like immediately. And when you're, you were like kind of fearful, and that's kind of what made me fearful. I was like, oh, and so that's why honestly, I took it so seriously.
You had a lot of stuff tattooed on your arms as well that looked kind of occultic as well. Almost, I mean, if I didn't know you, I would have thought, and I just met you on the street, I would have thought you were probably engaged in something like witchcraft. Honestly, I don't know. That's so I don't know if I've ever told you that, but yeah, I mean. Those sorts of symbols, and I think you've realized some connections here since then. But yeah, it's dark stuff.
I actually didn't. Yeah, I didn't know that, but
not because I know symbols from witchcraft, but it just seemed like
there's
general
something about
kind of vibe to it, so to speak.
Well, yeah, that's actually, well, there's a story about that. One of my tattoos specifically, when I was going through catechesis. By the way, this tattoo is something I designed. I actually remember designing it. I was sleeping. This is back when in college kind of time. I wasn't in school anymore, but I was still living in the college town. Didn't have any money or anything like that. I was really deep into drugs. So I was like paying some of these people to live. It was a party house for sure. But I was living in their pantry, and I paid a little bit of money. Like $100. You didn't know this?
No.
Oh yeah. I was Harry Potter for a while.
I'm just kidding. Gosh. Well, pantry's smaller than a closet underneath the stairs. That's what Harry Potter had, but wow.
Yeah, it only fit a mattress, so that it was very small. The mattress perfectly fit in the room, and that's where I slept.
Wow.
And
I never knew that.
So I was in my in my pantry room. Also, this house was used to be an old brothel.
Wow.
So it was now a converted house, but as you know, I mean, it's likely that house hadn't been blessed, and the things maybe attached to that house that we don't know of. I mean, so all these things were happening, but also it was a big, party house and lots of drugs. And I actually never even owned a key to that house. It was just because the door was always open and people just were coming in and out all day long. And so I remember sitting in my pantry, drawing, and that's where this tattoo that I have on my arm, my right arm, came about. Well, I thought I came up with it completely on my own. Like, I wasn't looking at the internet. I didn't have phones. I was just doodling away. And I thought, this is a great piece of art, and I should go get it tattooed in a very visible place. I'll never regret that. So anyway, but it wasn't until
I'll never regret that.
I'll never regret that.
So narrator's voice. Little did she know.
But it wasn't until years later when I started catechesis that Father he asked me. I saw him. He was looking at my arm one day while we were going through, and I could just tell. I was like, "Are you?" Like, do you want me to show you what, like, it seemed like he was trying to get a look at it, but wasn't sure what, whatever. And so, he asked me, he was like, do you have any demonic tattoos? And I said, no, I don't, I definitely don't have any demonic tattoos. And I was almost offended, cause I'm thinking that, not really offended, obviously, but I'm thinking that to have a demonic tattoo means that my intention was that it is demonic. And so because I intentionally would never put something demonic on my body, I was like, no, I for sure do not have any demonic tattoos, Father. And he goes, okay. He's like, what's that? And I was like, oh, I designed this myself. It's for sure not demonic because I literally drew it myself. And he goes,
sorry,
okay.
Just the naivete, the
I know.
It's just it can't possibly be demonic because I designed it. It's like,
I mean, I just didn't understand how it all worked.
That's true for all of us. Like, there are just things we can do where we don't realize what we're doing,
So Father ended up, after I went home that night, Father ended up calling me about an hour later, and he said, hey, just so you know, I took the time to research a little bit. He said not too much because and he didn't want me to research it either, custody of the eyes and whatnot. Yeah. But he said, I just want to let you know that I did find something that and I'm not going to share what it was that he found, but because I don't want to incite curiosity. But essentially, what I had on my arm was connected too connected to like a witchcraft. Something or other. And that blew me away. Essentially, my point is that blew me away because that was like when I had the most like creepy, like spine tingling moment. Like I felt like every hair on my back stand up and on my arms because I was like, I remember drawing this thing. Yeah. And then that was actually a really deep insight as to how the demonic can influence our lives. Yep. Is like, whoa. And so anyway, yeah, that was interesting. So
there were portals into your life that you didn't realize you had opened.
Correct. Yeah. Doors that had been opened for sure.
Yeah. So let's get to. Sorry, I know I brought it up again, but I think it's such an important point in your conversion story is that the counseling appointment where you're struggling with this transgender sense of not feeling comfortable with your femininity, being drawn toward being a man, quote unquote, and so you go to this counselor. Can you tell that story? Because I mean, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but it seemed like that was a really important point for you.
Well, it was kind of like the point that led me into. Well, so basically, I'm getting to the point now where I've socially transitioned. Now I have the desire to medically transition.
This is after COVID. It's after COVID. After the tarot card incident. You were off drugs, right? But I know there was a final bit right before your conversion, but you were off drugs during this period. I mean, hard drugs, nothing that would cause a cardiac situation. But yeah.
Yeah, so I was already socially transitioned, and I was very curious, and I actually had been curious for a while about transitioning.
I think I know what I mean. When you say socially transition, meaning just your friends were calling you by Roman?
I was going by people in my life that accepted this identity were already acknowledging me as if I was male or however I wanted to identify. They were using my different name, so they had no idea that my name was really like once Nancy, things like that. So I was in the process of changing everything about myself. So anyway, but I'm wanting to, there's a desire to look into medically transitioning and starting hormones and things like that. And, I'd already been looking up surgeries and all sorts of things for a while. But I didn't have the courage because, I mostly was afraid. It was actually, once again, my relationship with our mother that in many ways made that process slower. If our mother had not been in the picture and I didn't have a deep desire not to hurt her, even though in many ways I still did, I probably would have ended up medically transitioning. When you say
still did, but you still did hurt her, not intentionally.
Because I came out as transgender to her, and it really hurt her. But anyway, but I started going to a therapist, and I was like, well, I just need to, I needed to talk about this, what was going on in me, because what also is happening at the same time is not just like about what I want to do to transition. I'm actually in a significant amount of pain. That's one thing people, you hear a lot, like.
Or just
mental
emotional
pain.
Okay, mental. Okay,
emotional pain. Yeah, I'm in a fair bit of it, and it's almost so unbearable that I have to discuss it. And I'm thinking that the reason I'm in unbearable pain is because I can't. Maybe it's because, what they say is true. Maybe I need to transition. Maybe this transitioning will fix this pain that I'm in, because that was the narrative at the time. Yeah. They say, that's where things like, would you rather have a, dead kid or a trans son, or come in. And that's how the medical community would,
a diabolical false dichotomy. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's still played in my head thinking like I'm looking for any cure to this like malady that I have, this like, and this pain that I'm in. So I start the process somewhat, but I still had a lot of questions though, things that didn't quite make sense. Now, the funny thing is I didn't actually think that there wasn't an answer that made sense to my questions. I actually assumed there was, which is why I wanted to ask them so that somebody could easily clear them up and we could just keep going.
Yeah.
But what ended up happening was I had already seen multiple doctors throughout the course of time who had actually told me I was transgender before I ever even opened up and said anything about it, which was really interesting because I was really mad at one of them once because I was like, because I was not ready at all. It made me really uncomfortable that she thought by looking at me that I was trans, and I actually ended up never seeing her again. This was actually while I was at another rehab a couple years prior. So this had already been baking into my psyche for a while, but I wasn't ready to address it. And so finally
deeply irresponsible for a therapist to just project something onto somebody they just met.
But also I'm in a very fragile state.
Yeah, that just shows how I mean, I suspect in their own mind they believe they were helping in a very confused, disordered way. Like, oh, this person is this, they don't know it, and if I tell them that will help them. So I
Do you know what's crazy? Sorry not to interrupt, but you know what's crazy about that specific... What's crazy about that specific interaction actually with that therapist was that she wasn't... Oh man, like I still think about it sometimes when I think about it, it's like, man, I was in a very vulnerable place trying to get clean off drugs. This woman had no inclination, even though I told her that this is not true, I was not going through this because I was like totally shutting it down. She still convinced herself that it for sure was. So, because, oh my gosh, she looked at me and she said, I said, and this was years ago, so I'm just remembering the highlights of what I remember. But basically she was like, well, it's clear to me that you're, struggling with gender dysphoria. And I said, well, I didn't know what gender dysphoria was.
That part was true.
I didn't. Yeah, maybe. But then she said gender identity. And she says that because she explained it as like gender dysphoria, it's when you struggle with your gender identity. Yeah. And then I was like, what is gender identity? And she's like, it's where you want to be a man.
Instead
and
of confusion, I think the traditional definition of it was you're ill at ease with your sex, right? Like there's a psychological disconnect between your mind and your body, right? Which is different than your gender identity because that's like confusion within your mind, right? Anyway.
Once again, it connects to the desire, which the through line we've talked about this whole interview is that the desire, if you think you are your desire, that's going to become an identity. So, whereas gender dysphoria actually very much makes sense if you also look at the other part of my story where the discomfort with my femininity had become so difficult to manage for so long that it makes sense that I could also be confused in that way. When really I was just struggling with all this other pain and whatever that was going through. But, so anyway, I ended up getting to the point where I'm asking, certain questions that don't quite make sense to me. I'm also very involved in trying to find my own questions. So this is where I start getting introduced to people like Jordan Peterson, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, things like that. And I'm starting to hear like this pushback and these like really like articulate responses to like this ideology and things, to be honest, that I never even questioned.
Dennis Prager as well. We'll tell a quick little story about that at the right time. But yeah, just so people know.
Yeah, and Dennis Prager.
And Dennis, Dennis is a dear friend of mine, but obviously we have disagreements with him. Dennis has said some things that I'm just like, Dennis, what on earth? Famously on a Matt Fradd interview, which ironically I helped arrange because it was going to be a Christianity Judaism thing. It went in some directions I didn't think, but no, Dennis. we'll get into Dennis later, but. Obviously, we have some strong disagreements, but he and Matt Walsh and Michael Knowles and Jordan Peterson, they really helped you kind of stay anchored in reality, a base sense of reality, right?
They helped me. They presented questions and provided answers that really kept me digging for a more sensible answer to all the questions I was looking for.
And this was after that. This was after that dramatic moment with this counselor, right? And can you tell that dramatic moment?
Yeah, I will. But actually, no, this is all
before?
kind of during it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because
Okay.
I wasn't, just because I was listening to Jordan Peterson doesn't mean I was convinced right away.
Sure.
I was listening to him because he commanded attention with how articulate
Sure.
he was. And I respected that. And so like, I listened to him, not always necessarily conceding right away that he was right, but I was so intrigued by him that I was not going to write him off of as if he was wrong.
Sure.
And I listened.
Sorry, just to clarify something. So it wasn't that you had this moment. Well, just tell this moment, because I keep referring to it. Just tell people the moment really quick.
So the moment was, I ended up getting to the point where I had so many now of these questions that couldn't be answered. So before I wanted to medically transition, I wanted some therapists to be able to answer some of these questions before I made the decision, because it was becoming more clear to me just how intensely important it was to know some of these things prior to changing myself in a way that could be irreversible.
Yeah.
The funny thing is I still had the desire to do it. I wanted to transition myself, but I also thought to do my due diligence before I make such an irreversible choice, to make sure that I had, the facts straight. And that's what you would do with any medical condition. You know what I mean? That's a pretty standard thing to do. And so I thought, okay, well, so I ended up, but at this point I'm already so depressed. I'm so broken. I'm so this and that I'm very suicidal already at this point. Yeah. And I ended up going into the therapist's office and actually, let me back up a little bit and say this. Another thing that was occurring was that I thought if one of my questions about the transitioning, even though I still wanted to do it technically, like I think my lower faculty still desired it to some degree. Yeah. But I think there was also a part of me that thought like, well, if this isn't the cure, like what is the cure? Yeah. And then if that's the case, if there can be a cure to this, then give me that. Yeah. Like, can I be healed from this? Because here's one thing you'll notice when you deal with all trans people, almost virtually all trans people or people identify as trans and all people who identify as gay, almost across the board, almost, not all, but almost across the board, what people will tell you, and, they're lying if they say they don't, is that if they had a choice, and I say choice in the way that they are presenting it as if it's an identity. Sure. If they have a choice to not be gay, they would choose that, right? Yeah. Because they're confusing so nobody really wants to. It would be so much easier if I just had the right, temptation or the right, attractions and
which
I didn't
is
have to deal with
revealing
this.
in and of itself that most people, wouldn't.
Right. Absolutely. And so that was kind of the idea with this whole like transgender thing is like, I really thought about it. I was like, well, if I had the opportunity to live as a female in a female body, which I have, and feel good about that, would I not want that more? Like if I didn't have this weird desire that was happening underneath the surface of wanting to be a man, if I can pretend for a second that didn't exist and just kind of think through how that would feel, would it be what I wanted? Sure. And I said, well, yeah, of course. That would be, if I could love my body in that way and feel safe and comfortable in my own skin, then let's do that. And so I had asked the lady, well, when we started talking, I finally told her, this is the first time I actually ever even shared with a therapist that I was even having these experiences, because I didn't have the courage to. And finally I had come up with the courage to share with this therapist, that I was struggling with this gender confusion. Yeah. But I didn't describe it as confusion, really. I said, I can't remember exactly how I said it, but basically I was saying that I had these desires to want to be a man. Yeah. And I said, and so, she ended up looking at me basically and she said, there's nothing wrong with you. She said, you're perfect just the way you are. And in that moment, I actually just literally lost it in the sense like tears. Yeah. Cause I was so broken that I thought in my head, I was like, that is not true. Like, I know she meant it as like something to make me feel better. Yeah. Like, oh, you're fine. But all of a sudden this like affirmation of myself was not, it was so obvious that that's not what I needed.
Yeah.
I was like, that didn't feel good at all to hear that, because the level at which I'm so broken right now that like, it's almost like that made me want to die. Wow. Actually.
Wow.
That's what ultimately led me very quickly.
If this is perfection,
I
don't want to be less than perfect at this rate.
Well, that's what I told. That's funny. That's what I told her. I said, if this is what it feels like to be perfect, then kill me now.
Wow.
So I said, because I don't want it. I said, where's up from here?
What'd she say?
Well, that's where we started getting, she was a little confused at first, and then we started getting into questions, and I said, well, here's the thing. I said, if there's a way to be healed from this, I'd like to do that. And that's where I started realizing who I was in the room with. This is actually ultimately part of what did make me become suicidal later on, which is where I ended up having my conversion eventually. But because the desperation, what I realized is all of a sudden I'm in a room with a medical professional that doesn't see the flaws that I'm seeing. And if you can't go to your medical professional for help, then who else can help me? My parents don't know what the heck's going on with me. Yep. My brother doesn't know what's going on with me. Nobody knows what's going on with me. Half my friends are already sucked into the trans ideology. They're either just allies or they're not. And but either way, that still doesn't help me in what's real. Yeah. And now all of a sudden I'm on an island completely alone, like literally nothing. Yeah. Nobody can help me.
Wow.
I feel so isolated and so alone in that moment, because when I'm seeing things that are incongruencies in this like ideology that weren't making sense to me, like, I said, okay, well, I remember this is where I actually was accused of having internalized transphobia, because, and not even, and I don't want to say like, she was mean about it.
Sure.
She was presenting it in a way that she was trying to basically convince me, and I think she really believed this, so it's not like I think she was doing it maliciously. Sure. But I think she was trying to basically get me to see like, well, it's pretty normal to have internalized transphobia. It's pretty normal, especially because you probably felt ashamed for a long time to be your true self and things like that. And so I'm sitting there thinking like, but one of the biggest questions I had was, when we talk about gender ideology, this is what I remember anyway. And some of the big points that stuck out to me is that gender identity is different than like biological sex. Yeah. Right. So that's the claim that some of them will make, because none of them are on the same page. Yep. So it depends on who you're talking to, what version of the ideology you get. But this is where I understood it as was like, you can be, if you feel a certain way, you could just identify with that thing. Yeah. It has nothing to do with biological sex. That's the claim they'll make. But then what just did not make sense to me was then how is the cure then to change my sex? Yeah. That like, it's funny in a weird way. I was rooting for this to be the answer. Yeah. But they couldn't answer it. And I was like, but don't you see how that makes sense? Yeah. And then I realized really quickly, and this was because I'd been watching people like Jordan for so long that I had enough of an intuition to be like, okay, this is all red flags. Because when I said to her that her response to it was basically to say that I was being internally transphobic to myself, and that it made sense that I couldn't reason through these things or whatever because I was just ashamed. And I was like, what kind of answer is that though? That's such a, like, that's such a weird thing. It's such a weird thing, but it felt very like,
it was also like you were asking a question about, they were claiming that psychology and the body were not connected. But they were saying, to fix your psychology, you've got to change your body.
Which didn't make sense to me.
So you were asking, how does that make sense? And she responded with more psychology, nothing about the connection between the two. Right. I remember we started having these conversations where I forget whether you used the term first. I know I used the term, but I don't know if you had heard of it or not. But we had talked about the idea of natural law. So why don't you just say what you want on that? You're still learning, and it's great how hungry you are for knowledge from the church and whatnot. But like, just explain, because I remember us having some pretty deep discussions at that time, where it was like your reason was slowly coming back. It's like going to the outer limits of
That was after my conversion. I remember that day because I called you after adoration and I said we might have had we were having really interesting conversations
before you had your moment on March 19th.
Well, I know. I mean, I don't know if we're talking about separate times, but there's one distinct memory I have because I'll never forget it. It was the day I was literally walking out of the Adoration Chapel. I called you because I was so excited, and I said, the natural law. I get it now. I understand. Okay. That was I was already on my way to becoming Catholic.
I do remember though we had our dad out for a Christmas. I think it was 2022, and we watched What Is a Woman?
What Is a Woman?
Matt Walsh's. So why don't you? I think this would be fun, really quick, before we go on to the whole miraculous conversion. So this broke you essentially. The therapist saying you're perfect as you are. This was a make or break moment. Before we get into like the actual miraculous conversion, why don't you let's go through some of these different people who helped you maintain and regain a sense of reality really quick. If you had the chance to and I think you will get to see Matt Walsh here pretty soon in a few months, but let's just go one by one. Let's start with Matt Walsh because of the What Is a Woman thing. What would you say to Matt as far as his role in all this?
So I will say about Matt the best thing about Matt
think clip material.
Let me explain to you about a little something about. I will say, out of everybody, Jordan Peterson had the biggest impact, and getting me. He was the first. He was the gateway into this thinking differently for sure. Absolutely, 100%. But he kind of set me up to be responsive to someone like Matt Walsh. So then Matt Walsh enters. But the thing about Matt Walsh, obviously, the thing about Matt Walsh, one. You can't have a better humor. There's something about his very dry sense of just like to the point humor that I don't care who you are. There was even things that I still at the time when I was introduced to him that I didn't know if I fully agreed with him on yet, but I still just laughed at how his delivery was. It was just funny. Yeah. It was just hilarious. And I think that humor, even if he's not trying to be funny, he seems like one of those people who just is funny that doesn't try to be funny. Yeah. It's just kind of like who he is. That humor really allowed me to digest some really actually pretty big topics in a way that was like not really threatening.
Some hard truths.
Yeah. And so, and actually at the time I had known about Michael Knowles, but I actually didn't know how to think about Michael at the time, which is funny because he ended up being one of my favorites later on.
Like a fangirl now.
Oh my gosh, Josh, this is so embarrassing. Don't say that.
People will love it. All right, so let's just do quick 30, 60-second thank yous to some of these folks who on the natural level really helped get you to a good spot and prepared the way for when God finally got you. You know, they help prepare the way for that. So let's start with Matt.
Well, let me start with Jordan just so we can go in chronological order. So Jordan, obviously big thank you to Jordan because what Jordan really did is he set the premise for me kind of breaking through the ignorance of just things that I had kind of come to accept as they were. And so he kind of did that for me. And also he was oddly enough, the only therapist at the time, because I had such a distrust in therapists based on my experience that I knew had like I could listen to and still get some sort of like therapeutic advice, even if I couldn't talk to him. So thank you, Jordan, for being the voice of reason in that way. For Matt Walsh was he's just super funny, and so he presented a lot of cases that were very factual and truthful, but also in a very funny, digestible way. Also his like brilliance with these films like What Is a Woman was actually one thing I loved about What Is a Woman. I probably experienced it a little differently than most people who didn't go through any of these experiences of like, you know, identity confusion. But for me, it was actually such a breath of fresh air because I'm thinking like, oh my gosh, now other people are going to see all the things of how insane this is. And it even actually, even though you know it yourself, it's insane now, it also still was refreshing to see it laid out sort of in that manner. And it made me feel so much better about like not having gone down that path. And then Michael, he's like the third influence, I would say, later on. Matt Walsh led into Michael Knowles. And Michael is, one thing I love about Michael is that he was after, I actually really only started watching Michael after I was already on the journey to becoming Catholic. And one thing I love about Michael is that his public talking of the faith, Michael never shies away from a moment to involve his faith in what's going on. And to see a public facing Catholic, especially at the times like that, to just even speak about the Catholic Church and like what we believe and things, it actually, I feel like in many ways it gave me a lot of courage to continue to maybe even say, speak up in ways that might have been previously scary for me to be. I mean, these are public topics that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Yeah. They still don't want to talk about. I don't know that I always want to talk about them, to be honest, but there was definitely a time in the beginning where I was like, there's no way. But so just having those examples for sure been a big deal.
And there are many progressive Catholics who try to basically pretend the church doesn't teach what it does and blur the lines. So,
So he's and also Michael is very articulate. He's just very, I don't know how to explain it.
But he does.
Yeah, so I guess that's all that matters.
Yeah.
And then Dennis Prager, I love Dennis because one, obviously you know him, but I used to listen to his fireside chats a lot. So in many ways, he would just talk about things that were just in general had good life advice. And then, obviously I had a chance to meet with him that one when we went to Ruth's Chris, and I got to share a New York strip with him. But he was also very kind. Like one thing I'll say about Dennis is that who he is on screen is like exactly who you're getting in person.
Exactly.
Like there's not, it's funny. I actually remember the night when I showed up to your house to meet with him. Like we actually met before you even know, because we showed up at the same time. And when I got out of the car, I was like, and he's tall. I didn't realize how tall he was.
He's very tall.
Yeah. And he got out of his car and he goes, "You must be Nancy." And I was like, "We're going to be good friends." Dennis, I said, and And then I asked how Otto was doing and his, dogs, because, and so I know. So anyway, but his generosity and his time and his kindness, just in who he is as a person, is. Look, that is a rare thing. I just know it. Like I've met many famous people who do not reflect any type of charity in person. In a big way. And that just wasn't Dennis. So that was very striking to me that this man would be so kind. And
I'll tell the backstory on that really quick. So it goes back to 2015 when I had written a book called Liberty Secrets: The Lost Wisdom of America's Founders. And at the time, I was still Protestant. I had just done multiple years of studying the Founding Fathers from their original writings, and that bookshelf right behind me is pretty much all Founding Fathers. So reading their letters, their diaries, their essays, whatever. So I wrote this book, and Dennis was one of the few public intellectuals on the conservative side who I actually respected enough to have write a foreword to it. So I reached out to him, and wasn't succeeding yet. And so I eventually subscribed. I think it was like a premium subscription on Pragertopia or something, which was his website. And I knew that he loved classical music. So I sent a YouTube video of me playing Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, which is a famously difficult, gorgeous, amazing concerto by my favorite composer, Rachmaninoff. And so anyway, that caught his attention. And he said he would consider it, just send him the manuscript. He got back and he gave a very kind response. And he got back to me pretty quickly saying, "I'll do it." And I said, "Well, how much do you?" He's like, "I'll do it for free." He's like, "Just come out and come on the radio show." And so he hosted me at his home, him and his wife, Sue. Sue's great. I had arrived, I think I had arrived late the day before. And so I woke up in the morning. And so we got to hang out a little bit before he went off to the radio show. And he gave me a big ol' hug. And he used a Hebrew term. I forget what it was, but it meant, "You are a son of this house." And that was like the first thing he told me in person. And so really beautiful. And so I had told him, Yeah, because he wrote one of the biggest public conservative intellectuals had written a foreword for my book, and it was a very kind foreword and very, very, it was good. And so I'm like, I'll take you to dinner wherever you want. I was literally prepared to drop $500 or more, no problem whatsoever. I was prepared, and I was like, wherever you want, steakhouse, whatever. And I forget the name of the place, but there's this dinky cafe that he goes to all the time, like 2 minutes from his house. Him and Sue go to all the time. And it's like this all-American diner, and the bill for all three of us was like $60 with tip. And so and then I told him, and he thought it was so funny that how much money I was prepared to spend, and I thought it was funny that he didn't expect anything. So anyway, when he was doing a lecture out in our area, and I called him, I said, "Hey, I'd love if you could meet Nancy, because you had such a wonderful impact on her in terms of just reason and the natural law and morality, whatever." And normally, because we're in California, Dennis would have flown right back to LA because he lives in LA and he could get home that night. It's a short flight. But to meet you, he stayed overnight. And not only did
he was tired the next day.
He was tired, and he did his radio show from a local radio station instead of back home. But he did that for you. Yeah. And I got my revenge. I got to treat him to Ruth's Chris. I finally did get to drop my $500 or whatever it was, for all of us to have Ruth's Chris. And so it was really great. And obviously Dennis and I have some pretty significant disagreements. Don't agree with everything he believes. Likewise, he doesn't agree with everything I believe. But Dennis is one of those rare people who he actually believes, look, if you're a Christian, you believe Jesus is the Messiah. If you're not evangelizing me, then how are you being loving toward me, right? He gets that. Yeah. And in fact, I have a book coming out with Catholic Answers next year. The tentative title is The Third and Final Temple, How the Catholic Church Fulfills the Old Covenant. And it's going to be dedicated to Dennis Prager, who we continue to pray for his recovery. As of now, he's still recovering from a pretty significant injury. And so we're going to keep praying for him. But anyway, so Dennis was very helpful with that. Okay, so let's get to... and then just to kind of get forward, because I'm very excited to cover the actual moment God got you. So previously, like a year before that, I had given you a rosary. You had gone to the really quick. You had this interesting relationship with Our Lady and Saint Michael long before this happened. I don't know how long it was, at least a year or so. But I remember you had we were at a family dinner at Mom and our stepdad's house, and you didn't realize that Saint Michael was an archangel, something like that. And when I said, yeah, that's Saint Michael the archangel, he's like the chief angel of heaven, I remember you started crying. And maybe you don't remember this. Yeah, you were like very, very moved because there was something, because you've always had a string of Michaels in your life, right? Including our founding board member, Michael and Susanna Salazzo, who we're deeply thankful for and have really helped Eternal Christendom get going and keeping it going. And they're beautiful souls. They've returned to the Catholic Church themselves. So, but there's been this string of Michaels, and then now your patron saint is Saint Michael, the Archangel. And so I don't know if you remember that incident, but you had these like candles with our Lord and Our Lady on them, even before the moment. And it was interesting to me. And then it was interesting to me that when I mentioned the tarot card thing, you immediately seemed to give it up. So anyway, what was going on with all this? There were like these intimations of the Catholic faith before God got you,
Well, that was just as shocking to me as it was to you, although it's funny because sometimes I will see certain things like that happening in people's lives now when they're that I think are interesting, that I think, okay, Our Lady, our Lord's up to something, he's working on these people. But at the time, I didn't connect to that. There was imagery of Saint Michael was his imagery was so powerful to me because you have to remember, there's one thing I knew for sure, and that is that my life was just riddled with darkness. That wasn't something I was I wasn't I was quite aware of that. Yeah. I was very aware of how dark my life was, but also not only that, but how much I was suffering. I mean, ultimately it was leading up to this, I think the tarot cards probably really, really pushed a lot of things to happen really intensely. Like I'm almost convinced that that's part of the reason why I had that such intense experience I did the night I was trying to kill myself.
Yeah.
Because it was like there was so much going on in my head. There was so much like chaos. It was almost like I just wanted to shut the lights off just to get rid of the noise that was happening. It was just too much. It was so much like I felt like I was suffocating. And for whatever reason, when I was in the Dollar Tree, I'd go buy like some things at the dollar store, and I'd see these candles. And I saw St. Michael. I started by getting the St. Michael's, or when I was at the grocery store, wherever I saw these little, like, Catholic candles, which, by the way, I didn't know they were Catholic. I didn't really care. It wasn't like, that wasn't really the issue. It was just, to me, it was a candle, and I had this angel that was slaying the devil.
Yeah.
And at the time, the devil was just like it was just a symbolized something to me. And to me, it only symbolized darkness. So I saw it as something that just gave a face to what I was struggling with.
Yeah.
Little did I know how much I didn't realize
More than you bargained for.
But yeah, I didn't realize it was, But for whatever reason, I did, I gravitated to that for a while. And then the one thing that was interesting, I started gravitating towards Our Lady of Guadalupe. Remember I told you, I don't know if you remember this. I really wanted, before, when I was still really into getting tattoos and stuff, I said, I'm going to get a tattoo. I'm going to get one calf is going to be St. Michael. I had a whole piece laid out where it was just going to be this really cool piece. So it took up the whole back of my calf. That was St. Michael. And the other side was going to be Our Lady of Guadalupe. I wasn't Catholic at all. I just thought the image looked cool, to be honest with you.
I don't remember that, but it doesn't surprise me.
But you told me. Well, but it's funny because you told me, you're like, okay, before you get that, like, you need to understand who she is and have respect for her.
Oh, I do remember that.
So you must have been Catholic, and you said, and to not put her on my body unless I knew who she was, and whatever. And even then, now, obviously, I don't think that either of them really have the desire to be a tattoo on my body. So I don't have that desire anymore. But my point is
I didn't want you to dishonor them.
Yes, and that was like, I was like, so like, what?
Yeah.
But it kind of was the first time I realized this idea of Our Lady, but not in any way. I just knew she obviously is important to some people. But by the way, this is also a time where I didn't see a distinction between like Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady of Lourdes. I didn't understand. To me, those were all separate people. Yeah. That's how little I knew about anything. I didn't know anything about Catholics, so I didn't know, these are all Our Lady, all of our Mother Mary. Yeah. Just being, represented in different apparitions. And so, I would have told you they were all different people. But anyway, I didn't know the imagery behind it. I just thought it was the coolest thing. And I wanted this imagery. So then when I saw Our Lady of Guadalupe on the candles, and I started seeing some of those, I started picking up some of those as well. Yeah. Just because I thought they look cool. So
get us to that moment on March 19th. What led up to it? You go to the church. Yeah, just get us to that moment.
Yeah, so what led up to it essentially was this feeling like the answer, I wasn't going to find the truth. Here I was. I had this, therapist. She tells me the medical community is telling me I'm perfect. There's the conservative side's telling me I'm not perfect. I don't know how. I don't know how to make any sense of any of this. Nobody in my life can help me with it. They don't know how to make sense of it either. Like as to like, why do I feel this way? Because I still have the matter of going through the experience of desire, having this weird desire, and I've realized now at this point that transitioning does not make sense. Just like nobody can answer these questions. But I also don't have, it was very evident that I had nobody that would be able to help me try to heal whatever this was in my head. That was going on. So I was on an island, and things were just getting worse and worse. That's after I had got off meth. I had my one last little relapse of methamphetamine.
We didn't have Thanksgiving with you because you were detoxing.
Yeah, that was
this was the November before the March 19th. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember everybody wanted me to go to rehab again, but I ended up detoxing in my apartment with under medical supervision, and Mom and Aunt Juana helped me through that. So but anyway, after that, as you know, with methamphetamine, it like wrecks your brain. So I was very deficient in whatever I needed in my brain to feel good. So for months, I was just on the decline. So I'm already in pain, but coming down from meth is just like
brutal.
Almost, it's brutal.
Yeah.
It's so brutal. And I was like, all of a sudden, I wanted to die again just because I had nothing in me that was feeling like it could even, like I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't, I just didn't have anything in me anymore. Yeah. And that's when I decided I was going to kill myself. Yeah. But I also decided that I was in so much shame that I had put you guys through this again. And I thought I had enough sense about myself to know that I keep doing this crap. Sorry, this stuff. But at the same time, I know, but I keep doing this stuff, but I also know that I don't know. I'm like, I don't know why. Yeah. And I can't guarantee it won't happen again. It seems like, it feels like that's how unpredictable I am, even to myself. And
let me ask you a quick question, because so I remember you admitted to me that you had gotten on meth again.
Yeah.
But I forget whether you had suggested or I had, but it was like, when you get home, FaceTime me and show me you throwing it away wherever you disposed of it. And you had asked me not to tell mom and our stepdad.
Mom and dad.
Yeah, anybody. And yeah, there was a part of me that definitely did, and I eventually did, but I waited a bit of time. Was I just naive for that? Was that like just naive on my part to think that?
Yeah, you were, but not like in a bad way, because I also wasn't necessarily lying to you when I said that I had it under control, because I also was lying to myself. Because I really wanted to be like, look, when I say this is a drug that unlike anything I've ever taken in my life, it captured me so quickly and so deeply. It's the most demonic thing now that I know anything about anything. It is really like, please don't ever touch this stuff.
You felt like you needed it just to wake up, just to live.
Yeah. And had I known that this stuff, pretty much from the get-go, I needed it, not for the reason you would think, because it's not like physically addictive, but the reason was because I ended up the first time I ever took it, I stayed up for 3 days straight. I couldn't fall asleep. Wow. It was so powerful. And by the time, but I was also working. And so by the time I was starting to come down and I was starting to crash after 3 days, you can imagine how much you would need to crash. I had to go to work and I couldn't afford to lose my job. Yeah. So I'm in this weird position now where the only other thing that can lift me up is I have to take but a little bit. So then you start you're like, I'll just take a tiny bit just so I'm not up for 3 days. I'm only up for, the next 8 hours of my shift, and I can catch up and I'll never touch it again. Yeah. And it's just a cycle, and it just that's what really got me going. So it was pretty brutal. But
so you detox, we get through Thanksgiving, and March 19th is only 3 or so months away. So what's happening in those 3 months?
Just everything in my life. I'm just tired of fighting. I've been fighting the better part of 15 years. I mean, we're talking like after everything all said and done, failure after failure after failure, detox, rehab, mental health issues, everything. I'm just like, I am tapped out. Like, I can't do this anymore. I'm just.
And the family was a little bit too, not in terms of giving up on you, but like, we didn't know what to do either. It was just, a lot of help has been offered. This has been offered. I mean, ultimately, I did think it was a matter of coming to God, because it was like human solutions are not going to work. They're not powerful enough.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. Yeah,
and so I ended up deciding that I was going to kill myself, and as a result, I had taken the time to write all of you guys a goodbye letter that I left on my iPad.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I still have those.
Wow.
And
I didn't know. I knew about the potential suicide, but I didn't know about that. Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, I had finally decided I had everything all ready to go. And basically, mind you, I want to just emphasize that the reason for wanting to die was that I was in so much pain, and
Yeah.
I really didn't see myself as any more important than an animal. I mean, and I thought in my head, well, when animals are in this much pain, we
Put them down.
Put them down.
Yeah.
And that's another problem you see in our society. That's where you see like MAID and things like that coming in, assisted suicide. It's terrible now. I'm so glad I was not
What's MAID?
in the hands of people. It's just like medically assisted suicide.
Medically assisted. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't know the acronym. No.
No, it's okay, but it's being
Well,
abused
it's gotten
in many
really
ways.
bad in places like Canada too.
Canada, it's pretty
horrible.
awful.
Yeah.
But anyway, nonetheless, people in my position would have been like, offered that as a solution.
Yeah.
People with mental health, conditions, things like that.
Man.
Anyway, it's pretty bad, but I would have probably taken it though. Maybe if I would have.
Culture of death. Yeah.
And so I'd written you guys all these letters. I had already had everything set up, and I just want the pain to stop. The way I described it to actually a father I was recently speaking to was that the confusion. I was trying to paint a picture, because when you're in that place, at least for me, the level of confusion, darkness, and pain is so disorienting. It's not just pain. It's not like, imagine you just like physically cut yourself on your hand and you're like in pain. It's not just that. Pain, emotional pain, is so disorienting, especially when it's wrapped and woven into who you think you are, your identity. You can't tell if it's very disorienting. It's so crazy. It's like imagine you're in a dark pool, and you're that ability to want to survive. Now imagine that natural ability to want to survive is kicking in. You're swimming as hard as you can, thinking that you're going towards the surface. All the while you're losing your breath, and it's just this awful feeling of like, any second I'm not going to have any breath left. I need to get air to survive. That feeling of desperation. But then you hit the floor of the pool and you realize this whole time you've been swimming down.
Oh man.
And you couldn't tell.
Yeah.
That's how I felt.
Oh man.
That's the pain I was in. And it was terrifying, and it was all sorts of things. But so I just wanted to stop. Well, anyway, in the exact right moment, right as I'm about to do this, all of a sudden this thought came into my head. And the thought was so sharp. I don't know how to explain it. It was so it commanded attention, so much so that I stopped immediately because I didn't know how to answer. And the thought was, what if the pain doesn't end here? What if in fact it gets worse?
Oh man.
That was the part that terrified me, Josh. I could not go worse. Here I am already suffocating. I can't. What do you mean there's worse than what I'm experiencing now? The whole point of death is so that I can relieve myself of this. Yeah. I'm not a person who can afford to go lower than this or stay in this. And then quickly after that, I had thoughts of not only that, imagine it getting worse than the pain I'm already in, but now I'm separated from everything I've ever loved, my family, all these, that I'll never see again, ever. Yeah. And I'm thinking when I say that I have not felt a fear more intense than that, not knowing, but having to be forced to sit in this agonizing suffering that I was currently in. Now my way of being, of getting out of it was no longer an out, because I could not, if there was even a shred of doubt in thinking that this decision I was about to make would lead to more suffering and a greater suffering where I wouldn't have my family with me and all that stuff, I couldn't. It terrified me so much, I immediately stopped what I was doing, and that was actually in that moment that prompted me to. I was so desperate. I literally felt like physically and emotionally, I felt like I was being pushed into a corner, and I had nowhere to go but down to my knees. Yeah. And that's when I asked God, I said, if you're real, I said, please show me. I said, if you God, and I was screaming at the top of my lungs I must have been it was over 30 times. Yeah. It was insane. My neighbors, I'm sure, heard me. I sounded like an insane person. Yeah. I literally was screaming, bawling my eyes out, saying, God, if you are real, you have to show me. Mm-hmm. I said, you have to show me. I said, and I told him, I was I'm very stupid. Yeah. I said, I'm super, super dumb. And I think, that was important to say, because I think that I needed him to, I said, dude, you're gonna have to really make it this obvious for me, because I need to know, it can't be this, wishy-washy thing. I need to know without a doubt that you're real. Yeah. And then before I knew it, I had fallen asleep. I was just exhausted. I was laying on my bed, and I just ended up falling asleep. And the next day I woke up, and that's when I'm going into my side dresser drawer, and that's where this rosary is, which, by the way, I wasn't even so sure that like I had remembered. I don't have any memory still of you giving it to me. I just always assumed that you did. I know you've given me rosaries, but at the time, I don't know if those were since I was Catholic or not. But at the time, I kind of felt like, because you're the only Catholic I knew, and I didn't, because I couldn't remember the name of it when I saw it. It wasn't like I knew it was a rosary. Yeah. It was like, but I saw the crucifix. Yeah. And all I can remember is the night before, I thought it's interesting that it's sitting on top of everything too, which is very interesting because I'm in that drawer all the time. It's my junk drawer. Yeah. I eat like chapsticks, a lot of things that I just knickknacks, whatever. Sure. And I've never seen it before this moment. And now all of a sudden it's like right there and it's pretty striking to me. And so it seems important. So I pick it up and I basically go online and I try to figure out what it is. And I ended up realizing it's a rosary. Yeah. And that's when I realized Josh probably gave this to me. And I probably just threw it in there because I obviously didn't get rid of it. Thankfully. Yeah. But.
Well, then also before we get to March 19th, just say, and then we'll finish this after you say what happened. Why don't you tell the quick catechism story before we get to, because I had given you this catechism. And I had forgotten, but it was August 28th. You've joked about this on X. As a historical guy, I like to put dates and everything. And so pretty much the only gift I give to people is books. And so I'd given you a copy of the catechism on August 28th, 2019. This was about a month and a half after I came into the church. And I think I basically wrote a note to you saying, I think
I'll tell the story.
Sure.
So, Josh basically gave me, I just thought this was funny because I ended up seeing this again a while ago and I made a post about it on X. But so Josh gave me a copy of the catechism right after he came to the church. And I actually vaguely remember him giving me a copy. I don't remember the exact day, but I knew that when I knew I would have looked at the catechism and said, oh yeah, Josh gave that to me. So, but he gave me a catechism of the Catholic Church. Yeah, it was on, August 28th, 2019. You can see right there, he wrote everything. But what's funny is actually at the time when I had gotten it, this is way before my suicide attempt and my the story I'm currently telling you. But I could not even get through the first prologue of it. I was like, where is it?
Should be like right at the beginning.
Yeah, it is. The contents anyway, but as I did crack it open one time and just to see what was the big hype. Oh, here it is.
The big hype.
And the very and if you look here, since I've written things, but before this was you can't even see it on here, but
it's okay. Well, we can put a picture up or something maybe.
Yeah,
just read the paragraph.
Basically a prologue.
Yeah.
The prologue, it says, there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved than the name of Jesus. And next to it, I wrote, I question this. That's it.
Yeah. Oh, you didn't put the dots yet.
No, I put ...
Okay.
You can see that because it's all purple.
Yeah. ...
Yeah. Which is funny. And then I put it down never to collect dust for another 3 years.
Yeah.
But then after I came and I was in catechism class and I ended up seeing that again and I ended up completing the sentence and it says no more now. So now it says I question this no more.
That's
and
funny.
We just think that's kind of
awesome.
funny.
So you're desperate. You said, God, you got to reveal, you got to show me you're real. You got to show me you're real. Got to show me you're real. And then what happens after that? You find the rosary in your...
I find the rosary.
Yep.
And I figure out that it's a prayer, and I decide, well, what's it going to hurt to pray this thing? So I decided to...
Yes!
Yeah, I know.
Anybody who I know is praying the rosary, I'm like, you're taken care of. It may take a long time, it may take a short time, but they are going to be Catholic. So, yeah.
They'll be fine.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so I started praying the rosary. I prayed it, and I remember the first time I prayed it, just an enormous peace came over me. So much so that I continued to pray it for the next few days. The story goes that on a couple days after starting to pray it, I get this really big urge, this feeling that I need to go see a priest, which is really weird because I've never talked to a priest in my life. As you know, we grew up Protestants, so if anything, I would have thought it would have been a pastor that I'd feel the need to go talk to, but for some reason, I felt the need to talk to a priest. And that's when I ended up calling our now parish and asking to speak to a priest. And I went in there, and they, he shared with me a lot of things. And basically, I asked him if God was real, and I was like, and he was like, obviously, like he believed God was real. So
I'm a priest. What are you talking
to? Yeah. And so I was like, okay. But I basically told him I was on this. I just needed to know. I don't know if God's real. I want to know if he's real. And I said I'm gay. I was still like thinking that way. I was like, I don't know if I even fit into all this, and so on and so forth. And so we ended up talking for a while. He ended up bringing up the idea of catechism, which I didn't know what that word even meant. I thought he was casting a spell on me or something. No, I'm just kidding.
Catechism.
Obviously not.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
I was like, I've never heard that. Catechism kind of sounds like what a butterfly goes through when they're like morphing from a caterpillar.
Metamorphosis.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
like,
it's just such a, I know, it's just such a random word. You're like, okay, but now I know what it means. But
just means instruction.
Yeah, so
if you're a catechumen, I know you know this now, but just so people know, if you're a catechumen, you're being instructed in the faith. A catechism is an instruction manual about the faith.
Yeah. Anyway, and so he was sharing with that, and he explained what that meant, and I said, okay, well, I'm not really trying to be Catholic, so I just wanted to know if God was real.
And he goes, the face you did was like, I'm sure it was like an exact, like, not trying to be this weird Catholic thing.
I did. I really wanted to know that. I was super freaked that I didn't know if he was going to try to make me I was like, look, I'm just here to ask questions. I'm not here to join the club. That's not. And so he was like, well, you could still start if you'd like to learn what we think and how we believe and what our faith is. And so I said, okay, well, and I hadn't made a decision yet to do that, but I went home, kept praying the rosary. Another couple days go by, and I have this insane urge once again, this feeling that I need to see a mass, which is just so interesting.
Well, let's. I want people to understand one thing about this, about why. I mean, clearly these inspirations were not from yourself; they were from God. So you pray the rosary, you have a sense of peace. You go to our pastor. You just want to know God's real. You're afraid, because becoming Catholic would require you to change certain things, and you worry about being alone and all that. But then you feel like you need to go to mass. Well,
once again, I wasn't really afraid at that point because once again, I had no idea who God was. Yeah. I didn't connect it yet to being Catholic, which is weird. I just had the feeling of wanting to talk to a priest. So I went and spoke to a priest. I didn't really know what you guys believed completely yet. I assumed that, homosexuality was condemned, but I didn't know. And so, good distinction. Thank you. So anyway, a few days go by, and all of a sudden I'm continuing to pray the rosary. I pray it once a day. And by the way, just to make note of this, I'm praying the sorrowful mystery. And I chose the sorrowful mystery when I was researching it the first time to figure out what this thing was, because that's the only story that I knew. Yeah. I knew that Jesus died for us. That's the part of the story I knew. Now, whether I believed that was like a real story or not is a separate issue, but I know that was, so I decided to focus on the sorrowful mystery, which now I think is really, really very cool. For what ended up happening. But so I keep praying the rosary, and I come up a couple days later, it goes by, and I'm driving for Uber late at night. It's a Saturday night, early Sunday morning, and this urge just comes over me that is so strong, of this desire to want to see a mass. And I'm thinking in my head, that's kind of crazy. Like, I don't want to go to a mass by myself. Like, that's like, I don't even like when do people even have mass? And I'm thinking, oh, well, it's Sunday. I know they probably have it on Sunday. Probably. And so I was like, well, I'll just go back. I'll go online and I'll figure out that one parish I already had, that one place I'd already, gone to see what time they have mass on Sundays.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out they had a 7 a.m. mass, and I thought in my head that I should probably go to the first mass, because what I was fearful of at the time, I want to be clear, actually, my fear was actually didn't have anything, at least consciously, didn't have anything to do initially with what I'd have to give up. That came later, once the realization of God had occurred. But what I was fearful of actually was people. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want any of these people to see me, because I thought if they saw me that they would know I didn't belong there, and that
reject you.
They would reject me. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was so afraid of that. And so anyway, but I still had this stronger desire. I wouldn't even call it a desire. It was like a roadmap was being laid before me. And it was like I had the choice to follow that map, but I didn't have to. Yeah. But that's how it almost felt. I wouldn't have called it a desire, because I really didn't want to stay up the rest of the night and go to mass in the morning. But I knew that this urge, if you will call it, or this like inclination to go to a mass, what might be fleeting, and if I didn't go to the first one available to me, I probably wouldn't go at all. Yeah. And so that's why I decided to stay up and just go to the first one, because it was about 3 a.m. when this kind of came on, and I only know that because it's when I stopped driving for Uber, because the bars closed at like 2 a.m. and by the time I got home, it was around 3. Yeah. Wow. Which is funny in itself, which I didn't know then, but. So anyway, I ended up finding that they had a mass at 7 a.m. I stay up, I go to the mass, and upon coming to the church, that's when I started having what I know now, what I would now call a spiritual attack. I was so stricken with fear. It was the same level of fear that I felt the night I was about to kill myself, the one that was tempting me to end myself. And it was so strong, and the fear kept saying in my head, I kept hearing not internally, not audibly, things like, you don't belong here. Like, get out of here. Like, you don't belong here. You're not welcome here. They don't want you here. If they see you, they'll run you out of here. Things like that. But then I had this other thought, and it was such a calming thought. And I think this is my guardian angel, now looking back, but it was like this other calming thought was just keep walking. Just keep walking. And between the car and the parish doors was like a war you've never seen before. It felt like an eternity to get to the front, because it was so slow, because I was so fearful, but I just kept putting one foot in front of the other. Yeah. And I finally made it to the parish doors. Upon entering, I open up the doors of where they're having mass, and it is packed. It's just packed.
And you're thinking you're gonna have less people because it's early. Yeah.
Exactly. I thought there'd be fewer people who would be going to mass at 7 a.m., which is another reason why I decided to go at 7 a.m. Yeah. Well, I get in there. Mind you, I look like I belong at a pride parade. You know what I mean? Like, I look outwardly. It's very obvious that my identity is in being gay. I look like more boyish. I have very like a buzzed head. I'm wearing a t-shirt and pants. Jeans. Just whatever. I've covered in tattoos, piercings, which I've since taken all my piercings out. Yeah. But, all sorts of things. And so I ended up walking in there, and I'm thinking to myself, thankfully, there's a pew right by the very back. It's isolated by itself. By the very back door, you know what it looks like. Mm-hmm. It's by the confessionals. It's right there as you enter. So you're not actually inside the church all the way, but you are, but you're close enough to the door where you can make a run for it if you need to. And that was my thought process. I was like, I just need to get out of here.
But if you look straight ahead, you look at a wall, not the altar. So you can kind of look diagonally at the altar in a way.
Correct. Yeah. And so that's when I was sitting there, and the whole time I just wanted to get up and get out of there. I was like, I don't know why I'm here, but I just felt this strong desire and need. I don't know if I'd call it desire, but need to stay. And so I kept staying. And the only thing that kept me ultimately in my seat was that I had caught the gaze of this red candle. And there's a red candle at the very front, and it was lit up. And for whatever reason, when I saw this candle, I could not move my gaze from it. I just stared at it, and it was the only thing that kept me. It made me feel very calm, and all I could hear in my head was just keep looking at me, and that was the candle. Like I just kept saying that and hearing that in my head over and over and over again. And but I didn't. When I say I did not blink, I did not remove my eyes from this candle. It was the only thing keeping me in my seat. And because I didn't want to look at anybody else.
And just so people know, if in case they don't. Every Catholic church, pretty much every Catholic church, at least in America, has a red candle, which indicates to us that Christ is there in the tabernacle. The Eucharist, his real presence, body, blood, soul, and divinity is in the tabernacle. So that's why when we go in front of the altar, we genuflect and cross ourselves. We're showing reverence to Christ with us in our presence sacramentally. Yeah. So when you're looking at this camera, you're looking at the thing that indicates to us Jesus is here,
Yeah, and I obviously I didn't know that at the time. I didn't even know.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't even know what the Eucharist was. I knew none of this. I knew nothing about Catholic theology whatsoever. Yeah. And so I ended up, staying there as a result of the candle, and it kept me feeling very comfortable for whatever reason. And all of a sudden, right as the organ, I just remembered the organ started to play, and the moment that the organ started to play, everything in my body just lost it. I just broke down in tears. So much so that I was hard to hold back. Like I was plugging my nose. I was trying to not make a scene. Mind you, I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want people to see me. And here I am. And I cannot hold back my weeping. Like I've never cried like that in my entire life. And the reason I started to cry was because I had never felt such an intense degree of love in that moment. It was a radical love. It was life-changing. This is the best part of the story, but it's also the most frustrating for me to try to describe that feeling, because words fail at every it redefined my whole life in that instant moment. Because everything that I thought I knew about anything was just shattered, and the feeling that I had of just that love, it healed so much in me so quickly. Not everything, obviously. I don't think that's the case for anybody, maybe, but it healed a lot in the sense that it was obvious to me that moment that God hit it. 5 days earlier, I had a question, and the question was, God, if you're real, please show me. Yeah. And this moment, he had shown me, and I knew that he was real. From that point forward, I actually ended up starting catechism the following week, and I haven't looked back since. And so I was brought into the church later that year on September 29th, the feast day of
amazing.
St. Michael. RCIA had already started, so just so people know, I didn't come in during like Easter or any of those times, because I was late to the program, so they took me through. I had the awesome benefit of being able to go through catechism one-on-one with a priest, which was nice because it really afforded me a lot of opportunity to ask all the questions that I wanted. I had some very individual attention given to me, which was amazing, and I'm always going to be grateful for that. But instantly, the most palatable thing I remember feeling was like this idea of love. Like I knew instantly that whatever I thought love was before, that I knew that wasn't love. And I knew that, and that's what really made me like accept instantly the teaching of the church. Yeah. Here's the funny thing. I have a unique experience that I'm realizing the more I talk to people, that I'm probably one of the few people who accepted all the precepts of the church before even knowing what they were. Yeah. Because I hadn't gone through catechism. I knew nothing about the faith, but I knew this was Christ's church because of that experience. I knew that this was God. I didn't know what I didn't know what the Eucharist was. I didn't know any of that stuff yet. And what's even crazier is that this was on March 19th, the feast day of St. Joseph, and what's really interesting in hindsight, because that I learned was that, Our Lady through the Rosary brought me to the church on the feast day of Saint Joseph to meet their son Jesus. I mean, that blew me away. The whole entire Holy Family. Was involved in my amazing conversion. And so, but yeah, that was the beginning of my Catholic journey, essentially, and it changed me instantly, in such a profound way.
You thought in your head, this is Christ Church. So you thought something like that at that moment.
Well, yeah, because I didn't, I couldn't imagine finding God at a church that wasn't his. Yeah. That just seemed like an obvious connection. Sure. So I didn't really, it's not that I necessarily thought about, I wouldn't say I had that exact thought, like, this is Christ Church. It was that I met him here. And a couple days prior, I had talked with a priest who had offered to share with me what the faith was and what the belief was. And I know he had actually mentioned that it was Christ Church. Yeah. So I think in that moment, it was no question. It was like, okay, that was evidence of what had already been shared with me. Yeah. And so that, yeah, it was like a no-brainer, honestly. I just didn't question it. It wasn't like a... And so, but also, all these thoughts came to my head was like, it instantly, it's funny because like I come from a community of people who say things like, love is love. And why can't I just love another human? And the truth is like, I didn't even know what love was. I mean, it was like instantly the shackles were just instantly removed from my eyes and I could just see, and I was so overwhelmed. And I understand now why God doesn't reveal himself all at once, because if he had revealed even a fraction more to me of himself than he did in that moment, I would have just like disintegrated because I just couldn't handle it. I just couldn't handle it. Like when I say that everything in me just collapsed, in a surrendering kind of way. And so that's when I realized, I accepted every precept of the church because I knew instantly that if he was real, then his teachings were real. Yeah. And if I didn't understand the teaching of his church, then it was not a matter that he was inadequate. It was that I was inadequate. And I also believed through that love that he showed me that he would help me understand in time, because he's a good father, that love could only come from a good father. And that I just knew I had such an enormous faith instantly in that moment, which was a huge grace, that he would walk me through this. That I knew. That's amazing. Yeah.
Well, and as I've talked with you about, it's like you were, and not everybody feels it in as dramatic a sense as you did, but what you're describing fits the church's description of the theological virtue of faith. And as we said earlier, virtue is a habit. So, I mean, as you said, it's not like you didn't know all the teachings, but you had this habit, this disposition to be like, I will believe what Christ Church teaches. So, and that was the virtue of faith. It wasn't a set of propositions in your mind. Those propositions are very important, right? But it wasn't, the virtue of faith is the disposition to believe what God has revealed on his authority, right? Yeah. And so what you're describing is receiving that gift, which is from God. It doesn't come from ourselves, through no works of our... Clearly, you had no works and no merits to show to God at that point, right? But you were cooperating with the graces he was giving you, which even your cooperation was the result of his grace. So, which is all the more wonderful because of the meaning of your name.
Yes.
Which is
Nancy, which means, which translates into grace, which means undeserved favor. So
there you go.
Unmerited favor, which is definitely true in my case. So yeah, it was, and I wanted to be clear, people, it was such an intense gift, but what it really did, cause I still had questions, like there were things that's actually what kind of set my heart on fire to learn as much as I could. I mean, at that point, once you accept that the church is who she says she is, then everything else is really easy in the sense, and I say easy as in simple in the way of like, now I just became an investigator of like what she taught. Yeah. It wasn't about, I didn't have to go through the hurdles of questioning everything she taught to see if that had merit. That wasn't really the issue anymore. Thankfully that was a roadblock that had been removed from me. And I'm very grateful. And I know a lot of people don't have that, that experience. So I can only imagine the types of hurdles I'd have to go through if I had questioned everything the church had taught.
Yeah.
But I didn't have to do that, thankfully. And now that didn't mean that. I want to make this clear, though. It's not that didn't mean that the journey wasn't uncomfortable.
Sure.
It was incredibly uncomfortable.
Sure.
In fact, that's where this is where my love of adoration sort of came into play, because once somebody explained to me what the Eucharist was, and I had my experience, because I didn't know what the red candle meant. It wasn't until I told somebody the story for the first time that they told me, like, do you even know what that red candle means? And I was like, the candle means something? Like, I just thought it was a candle, you know? And so, and when I started having all these, like, people were telling me what my own experience exactly, like, what was going on. Like, they had known the Eucharist was present. They had known this was the holy sacrifice of the Mass. They had known the power of the Rosary. That I wasn't privy to all that at this point yet. I just knew I had this experience. And so it blew my mind, just like time and time again, it just blew my mind. And so I was like, whoa. And when I found out adoration, because I didn't even know that was a thing until a little while later, but I literally would just spend like literally almost every single day in adoration, because I almost didn't feel right. I mean, people don't know this, but when I came into the church and I finally had renounced my old way of living, even if I didn't understand everything yet, and I didn't know how it was all going to look, because this is when I did have a lot of fear. I had a lot of fear, not in that I didn't question if I was going to give it up. That was obviously not a question. I was going to give everything up because Christ Church says, you know, this is a way we live and blah, 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 all this stuff. So that wasn't the issue. It was the issue of fear came into, like, not knowing how things were going to look. And I mean, here I am now. I'm like, I mean, talk about like a little bit of suffering I had to go through to, you know, I had to resign to the fact that I might be alone forever.
Sure.
You know, because people who identify as being gay, you know, we want all the same things anybody else wants. We want families. We want marriage.
Love,
you know, we want all these things.
Yeah.
We want love. Yeah, exactly. And so
family.
I had to be okay all the time with giving up these big parts of what I thought my life would have, just like any other, you know, and not know where that would lead me. Well, and you know, I didn't understand the natural law yet. I didn't understand any of this stuff. It still didn't make sense. I still had the old brain, the old broken way of seeing things that made sense to me, but I fought against, I didn't have to struggle with the knowledge that it wasn't real. I was almost like living in the way I describe it was like, if you see, this might be a bad example, but if you know, like those room of mirrors where you never know which way is like actually going. Yep. It was like, I knew I was in a room of mirrors. And so I didn't have to be fearful of the fact that I didn't know exactly, what was real and what wasn't, or no, I'm sorry. I knew none of it was real. Okay. I just knew it was confusing. Got it. Does that make sense? I was confused. The old brain. The old brain. Yeah. I was still confused in the sense that I didn't understand the teaching yet. Yeah. Because I hadn't even started catechism yet. I didn't know any of these things, but I knew that the confusion wasn't real. Yeah. Like it wasn't, whatever I was confused about was wrong. I knew that.
It could be brought to a place of order and clarity.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it. But
being clarified and order and being ordered.
Yeah. Yeah. And I had faith that would be, that a good father would do that for me. Yeah. And he did. And so I spent a lot of time with him in adoration. And, you know, in some of the days following, I actually felt very unstable, in many ways, not being close to him. So sometimes, even when Adoration Chapel wasn't available, I would just go sit in the church. Yeah. Because I knew he was there. Anytime I saw that red candle, I knew he was there. And so I would just sometimes go sit in an empty church, just knowing he was there. And so, you know, and then slowly as time went on, as I started learning more about the faith, these things came to, you know, pass, and I started to really understand. I mean, we're talking the next couple of years. I mean, even now he still helps me understand, like, you know, aspects of like how I even got to the place that I was living in previously. Like, it makes, you know, so he helps you. Yeah. And so, it's been really incredible. And, you know, I also had, you know, like, you know, the very real experience of finally I was actually being overtly attacked in many ways.
I mean, we'll keep the details private, but I mean, demonic dreams, very real, tangible, like they were not going to give you up without a fight kind of dreams.
Yeah,
and maybe even not
bad.
even just dreams, but physical, even quasi-physical encounters.
Yeah, there was some stuff that happened that was pretty intense. But, you know, in a weird way, I want to point out, though, this is actually Father Ripperger, I would consider like a lifesaver in this regard, because it was his sermons a lot of times that helped me understand what I was facing in that regard, along with our own priest, obviously. And one thing I realized was that even though it actually kind of made my faith stronger when I went through that, though. Because when you're out there in the world, and you know the demonic doesn't want you to know it exists, so it's actually better hiding. Yeah, and, you know, and making you think that, you know, these are all just, you know, whatever. And so, but when you actually renounce them and you actually go to Christ, and then now they're overtly involved, and like, it becomes, you're like, oh, this is so real. Yeah. Like, oh my gosh, this is insane. Yeah. Like you're in a battle for your life. And
what about that one story? I forget the introductory details, but where I think it was in a dream, and you learned about the power of Our Lady's prayers. What about that story?
Well, so as I was going through these experiences, obviously the first person I went to was my brother. I was like, this is happening. And he recommended I go to our priest. I won't go into details, but basically...
just for people who maybe don't know.
Oh, yeah. My brother is the person right there.
Is there another one I haven't heard of? No.
Well, we do have another brher, but he's only 8, he didn't. Anyway, he's 10 now, but anyway... So I went to our priest, and my priest recommended that I write down what I was going through. And a lot of what I know now, which I didn't know then, I didn't understand why I was supposed to write these things down. It was just to keep, because in order to discern if these are really like demonic in nature, or if we're just kind of having other experiences, you know, there's signs and consistencies and things like that occur in some of these things, which I didn't know about. And so anyway, I started noting these dreams. Well, eventually, once my house was blessed, the dreams subsided dramatically, but they still occur. And what we realized was they're happening on the 13th of every month, starting in May. And that's Our Lady of Fatima, which is interesting. And I didn't know the connection, because I wasn't that deep into the faith yet of knowing all the apparitions. I was still learning about the faith itself.
So March 19th, you have that encounter. And then in the ensuing months, you're received into the church September 29th. So it's in those ensuing months where you're tracking the dates of these things, and you're realizing it's always on the 13th.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I didn't put that together, because somebody else who told me about Fatima eventually had put that together. Yeah. But yeah, so my dreams were happening on the 13th of every month, starting May 13th, which is interesting. And it only happened for 3 more months after that. So I didn't go through the whole year. It ended March, May, June, July, August. So August 13th. Sorry. Yeah. It was August 13th. That was my last dream, and in the dreams, they kept getting the demonic kept getting weaker. So, for instance, in the last dream, it actually wasn't too bad. I just had a dream that I was running away from a bunch of demons that were chasing me, and I could hear the noises, and it was like really scary. And all of a sudden, I'm running, and I see a statue of Our Lady. And instantly in the dream, I stop. And I say a word that I didn't know was a word at the time. I didn't know why I said it, or I even wrote it dramatically wrong in my journal, because I was trying to explain like what it was, and I tried to like sound it out. But I ended up saying, I was running, and all of a sudden I stop, and I see a statue of Our Lady, and I gasp, and I was like, Holy Theotokos, or Theotokos. And the demonic completely dissipated. Everything just disappeared. Gone. Yeah. And then all of a sudden I look over, and there's a man sitting at this beautiful wooden table. And he's got like long hair. He almost looks like Jesus, but I knew he wasn't Jesus. He had longer hair like this. He was sitting in like a carpenter kind of situation on a nice wooden table. And I look at him, and he looks at me, and he says, basically he says, yeah, people don't realize how powerful she is. Yeah. And then my dream ended. And now I think that to be, I didn't know this at the time. It took me a long time to realize this, actually. I'm pretty sure that was Saint Joseph.
Yeah.
And so,
and what does
it makes sense
Theotokos
because
mean for those who don't know the term?
God bearer.
Mother. Yeah. In English, it's typically, you're right. Literally, it's God bearer, but Mother of God is how we typically refer Mother of God. That was the term, like in the Council of Ephesus, when the church, was very clear about this. She's the Holy Theotokos, the Mother of God. And
and I didn't know.
I had forgotten about that detail, that you didn't know the word, and yet again another example of God giving you a gift. It's just, and then I know I'm wearing my rosary. I know you keep yours with you.
I have mine right here.
It's just Our Lady is her prayers are transformative. She says in the Gospels, in the Magnificat, "My soul magnifies the Lord." So it's like, whose soul magnifies the Lord? And it's Our Lady, because she was the vessel through whom God began his assumption of human nature in the Incarnation, which is the central mystery. The Trinity and the Incarnation are the central mysteries of the faith. And so anyway, we could go on and on about Our Lady, but I do remember telling you at one point, because I know you were afraid of, loneliness and whatnot in the long term, but I do remember having a brief conversation with you. I think it was out in the parking lot of the parish, where I talked about, before becoming Catholic, like I resisted it in various ways because there were all sorts of things I'd have to do or not do, as it were, as a Catholic, even, frankly, even sexual things that the church says in marriage. Nope, you don't. Those things are not licit even in marriage. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. And also, but what happened is all that is silly to me now, because my habits have been changed through grace and to the extent I cooperate with it. And I started praying the Rosary January 1st, 2019, every day. And it's been transformative. There are sins that I thought would be part of my life forever, and they've gone away. There's temptations, but they've gone away, because nobody cares more about people coming to Jesus than Our Lady. Nobody. And her rosary is, the prayer that we say the most often in the Rosary, the Hail Mary, are the words of Gabriel to Our Lady, announcing the Incarnation. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. The second half comes from her cousin. And so that's the prayer we're saying most often. It's all about the Incarnation, this assumption of human nature that's damaged and broken by divinity to heal and save it. And then the other prayer, it's, and we're going through the mysteries of the Rosary. It's all the gospel. It's all the gospel stories. You're thinking about the events of the Bible. The whole, the whole Rosary is biblical in that sense. And so anyway, we should do another interview or episode about the Rosary and Our Lady, but that you knew that term, Theotokos, without having ever heard it. And I know it's interesting. Just a super quick comment. I know that there were many times in my life prior to becoming Catholic where I would have these pretty dark dreams, and there'd be just dark figures or whatnot, and I'd go to speak against them, but I couldn't. I couldn't.
Yep, that was part of my dreams too.
Yeah. So it was just, that'd be a whole other topic. But so it's going down, and then we get to September 29th, and this is a little bit of a joke, but why don't you tell this quick story about, that because they normally make a male version and a female version of a saint's name, and it was just kind of a funny joke, but
this is kind of just our little humor. So I obviously took St. Michael as my patron saint, and usually they'll do the female version of your patron saint if it's the opposite. Obviously angels don't have a sex, but it's often depicted that Michael is a masculine figure. So with that being said, the priest did end up saying St. Michael, And I knew, because Josh had told me prior that he would probably say, the female version, but he didn't. And so I looked at Josh afterwards. I said, I guess I am a boy after all. I said,
Yeah.
It's a little dark humor, but it was just kind of funny.
But a glorious fulfillment of all those things and everything that brought you to that point. Yeah. And
so
we'll have to talk at another point about the liturgy, because this was at a traditional Latin Mass. Which, most of our family goes to now. And if you would have told us that not that long ago, I would have thought you were nuts. Growing up in evangelical Protestant, you all are going to worship at a traditional Latin Mass parish. It's unthinkable. But but now, I'll tell you, just on my personal side, when you came to the church, even now I think about it, it's just like, all human hope was gone. You've described that yourself, but all human hope was gone. We were praying the rosary for you quite a bit. I suggested to Mom, because Mom was very worried, and I told her the story of St. Monica and St. Augustine, St. Monica being St. Augustine's mother. And St. Augustine describes this in his Confessions, but that she would constantly pray for him. And she basically asked God to basically bring him into the Catholic Church and allow her to see it. That was like the thing she was living for. And then soon after he became Catholic, she passed away. But he says in the Confessions that she had asked, please remember me at the altar. So, very Catholic thing. And so, but I had actually visited Tunisia and saw one of the churches where she prayed for her son Augustine, who turned out to be one of the greatest Catholics in history. And so I told Mom, I was like, you should ask St. Monica to pray for Nancy. And then when Mom came into the church, her patron saint is now St. Monica. And so just a beautiful turnaround. And I guess the lesson I've used your story for so many people. I have people reach out all the time that are just desperate about their family, their friends, whatever. And I ask, are you praying a daily rosary for them? And, sometimes they are. I'm like, stick with it. And many times they aren't. I say, you need to get serious and pray a daily rosary, not only for yourself, but for your family member. And I've just seen so many conversions, both of us. We've seen yours, I think to whatever extent there was some prep work, so to speak, I think the rosary was absolutely vital. So
yeah, for sure. Well, and I often tell people, because people can lose hope, which is hope is a theological virtue, so it is a sin to lose hope in that way. And so my only point in saying that is that a lot of people I've noticed they'll lose hope because they are looking at the source. So they're looking to the person who is broken to give them hope for something that can be changed. And I just want to say that if you are looking at the brokenness that is the person, whoever you're praying for, as the way to justify your hope, you're going to lose it every time, because we can't give you that. Like if you look at us too long, we will make you hopeless. But that's also a good indicator that if you're feeling that, maybe you're focusing too much on what the problem is and not enough on Christ. And so my only, not that it's not enough. I want to be careful in how I'm saying this, because there are people who very much pray all the time who are still very faithful and they struggle. And I don't want to diminish that. That's not exactly what I mean. I guess what I'm trying to say is that one of the biggest journeys that I've been on since becoming Catholic and continuing to be, and I guarantee you it'll probably be the one I go through the rest of my life, is this constant coming back to Jesus as the source of all hope. So Jesus, I trust you, take care of everything. I did a surrender novena for so long. And I still do it occasionally from time to time when I'm just, because fear, one thing our father, our priest had said to me that was so simple, and so powerful, and I'll never forget it, is I was really struggling going through fear, and I was sitting with him, and he said, fear is not of our Lord. So it's a good indicator that if you're in fear, that you could at least be comforted in knowing that is not coming from God. And so it gives me I get to quickly realize that whenever I'm in fear, and then the act of surrendering it to God and kind of realigning myself with Christ and is very, man, surrender will bring you peace. It'll bring you peace like nothing else. That's how I know I'm in tune with what God's with God more than I am with my fear.
Yeah.
Is that there's a peace that comes once you actually have surrendered.
Yeah.
And sometimes that surrender happens over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
You have to constantly keep surrendering.
Yeah. Becoming a Catholic is not a one-time conversion. It's a lifelong conversion. We've got to, especially as we're doing during Lent, we've got to take up our cross every day. It's a decision of the will. I want to wrap up here. I won't mention their names, but I did want to mention just there are some pretty amazing friends. They're now married. They were engaged at the time, but some pretty amazing friends who normally don't go to the 7 a.m. Latin Mass, but they did that day. And well, I'll let you tell the quick story about them. But the point is that God, the story as it is amazing on its own, but God had actually brought people there for you. As well. Yeah. So just quickly tell that part as well, because I think it's important that they that part of the story be told. So
I have one of my, what I would consider now one of my best friends. Sure. So I was afraid to be at the Mass that day. I want to make that a point again to make a note of. March 19th, Feast Day of St. Joseph. Well, there's another friend and there's a lady there who, when I started crying, remember, I was afraid that these people would reject me. Yeah. And then the second I started uncontrollably crying, this lady came up to me and she just sat next to me and put her arm around me. She didn't say anything. She just sat with me. It was like she knew that something was going on, and she just wanted to be there with me. And after, I immediately wanted to learn more. I just felt like I want to know more about the faith, and I'll start catechism, but I want to get started now. Where do I go now? So it's okay. And then we ended up having, after we walked out of the parish together, and her then boyfriend, now husband, were there. And it's funny because so she was brought to the parish that day because she has a significant devotion to Saint Joseph. And Saint Joseph has helped her in many ways heal some of her own father wounds. Yeah. And so I think it's beautiful that Saint Joseph was there on the feast day, and that was what brought her there. It's so, you can't make this stuff up. It is so, God is such a good author. It's truly indescribable. But I had asked her, I basically said, do you know of any Bible studies? And she goes, oh my gosh, I was going to invite you to our Bible study, but I didn't want to be too forward. Yeah. And then from that point forward, it was history. So I ended up going to my very first Bible study with a group of Catholic girls, and they were all my age. And that's when I met, oh my gosh, I almost said her name. Sorry, I won't say for privacy's sake. Yeah. Yeah. Although I'm sure they probably wouldn't mind, But yeah, that's when I finally got to meet. And by the way, I had only been friends with boys to this point. I had never really been friends with females. Yeah. So I didn't know how to have female friendships. And so so really I was there, and it was not only the start of my Catholic journey in a real way, but also it was the start of God didn't allow me to walk away alone. Yeah. He gave me community, and church. He put me in the hands of people. Yeah. His body. It was just, it was amazing. So.
Well, this has been amazing. I know most of the story, but there were even details that I learned today that were great and make it even more powerful. So, I'll just say, as your brother who, most of our lives, didn't, get to experience anything like this with you. Couldn't be happier. And you always had a kernel of a beautiful soul, but obviously it was mired in a lot of sin. But that beautiful soul has been made resplendent by Christ, and it's getting more and more beautiful all the time. And
thank you.
So very proud of you, and very very happy, just happy. And now we pray for one another that we persevere to the end, and attain
fortitude,
attain he whom we long for. So
yeah.
So I'll leave the final word to you.
No, I think I would like to say thank you to not only my family and those close to me that prayed for me, like my mother and my father, because my father became Catholic before I became Catholic, and my brother, obviously, and my friends, but also just to the Catholics in general, who are fervent in their prayer. I don't think we realize how important prayer really is. It's one of the most difficult things to adjust yourself to, because to be honest, most times it could be really boring. It could be like you can get this. We're so sidetracked in life with like the busyness and the chaos, which I'm not so sure we were even meant to live in this level of chaos. To be honest, I mean, there's the constant phones, the social medias, the inundated with news. Like I don't even think that that's even like natural. But I mean, because we live in that world, I think that it makes it extra hard to find peace and quiet times that we stay at. And so I know that there are other priests that Josh had pray for me. Those priests know who they are. I just think people in general who have such a good faith enough to pray for those who don't even know. And I think I'm probably standing before you because people so graciously offered their time to pray for somebody they didn't even know. Yep. So
prayer is the
beyond grateful,
invisible cardiovascular system of the world and of history. So no, that's a great reminder. Well, like always, we'll end like we normally do with the anthem verse I've had since college, and it reflects very well what you just said. And it's Psalm 73, verses 25 through 26. Who have I in heaven but you, and on earth I desire nothing besides you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but the Lord is the strength of my heart and my portion forever.